There is a short moment in almost every episode of SpongeBob SquarePants where the sponge wakes up, throws his arms into the air, and shouts that he is ready. Ready for the same job, the same grill, the same Tuesday he has already lived 1,000 times over, and he means it with his whole heart. A German philosopher who died the year before the last century turned, looked at a creature exactly like this, a small creature, perfectly happy in its small repeating life, and he called it the most contemptible thing a person could ever become. He gave that creature a name. He said it was coming for all of us, and worse than that, he said we would cheer when it finally arrived. Tonight we are going to sit with that idea for a long, slow while, and see whether the happiest cartoon ever made is secretly the warning a lonely man left us more than 100 years ago. So get comfortable, turn the lights down low, and if you have not subscribed yet, it really does help us keep making these. Let me start with the man who did the warning, because almost none of what follows makes sense without him, and because he is far stranger and far gentler than his reputation suggests. Friedrich Nietzsche was born in a small Prussian village called Röcken in the autumn of 1844, the son of a Lutheran pastor who died when the boy was still very young. He was a brilliant student of ancient languages, so brilliant that the University of Basel gave him a full professorship of classical philology when he was only 24, before he had even finished his doctorate. Picture that for a moment. A young man barely out of his own studies, standing in front of a lecture hall, already the youngest person ever to hold that chair. And then picture the rest of it, because the rest of it is where the sadness lives. His health collapsed. He suffered blinding headaches, stomach agony, eyes that could barely stand the light, and by his mid-30s he had to give up the professorship entirely and drift from boarding house to boarding house across Italy and Switzerland, writing in the few clear hours the pain allowed him. He wrote almost all of his greatest work as a sick, half-blind, mostly friendless man, moving between cheap rented rooms, and then, in the first days of January of 1889, in the city of Turin, his mind gave way completely. There is a famous story, and I want to flag it as a famous story rather than a documented certainty, that he saw a horse being whipped in the street, threw his arms around its neck and wept, and never wrote another sane word again. He lived another 11 years in mental darkness, cared for first by his mother and then by his sister, and he died in the summer of 1900, right on the doorstep of the century that would misunderstand him more violently than any thinker has ever been misunderstood. I bring up that whole biography, the illness, the loneliness, the collapse, because the popular image of Nietzsche is of a snarling, cruel, mustachioed prophet of power, and that image is almost entirely wrong. This was a shy, courteous, physically fragile man who loved music and walked in the mountains and cried over a horse. When you read what he actually wrote, and I mean read it slowly rather than in the shape of the slogans it has been chopped into, you find something closer to a doctor than a tyrant. He thought a sickness was coming for the modern world, and he spent his short working life trying to name it before it arrived. He did not celebrate the sickness, he dreaded it. That distinction is the whole reason this video exists. So what was the sickness? It begins with the single line everyone has heard and almost everyone gets backwards. God is dead. God remains dead. And we have killed him. Nietzsche put those words not in his own mouth but in the mouth of a madman who runs into a marketplace in broad daylight carrying a lantern, looking for God, and is laughed at by the crowd of comfortable people who have already stopped believing and simply have not noticed what they have done. The madman is not gloating, he is terrified. He asks how we managed to drink up the sea, who gave us the sponge to wipe away the whole horizon, what we were doing when we unchained this earth from its sun. Read the passage carefully, and it is not an atheist doing a victory lap. It is a man describing a catastrophe that the people around him are too content to feel. The point was never that God does not exist. The point was that Western civilization had built its entire sense of meaning, its morality, its idea of what a good life even is, on a foundation that people no longer truly believed in, and that when that foundation quietly rotted away underneath them, they would be left standing over a hole with nothing to hold them up, and most of them would not even look down. That hole has a name, and the name is nihilism. Here is where I need to be careful, because this is the exact place where a philosophy essay usually goes wrong. Nietzsche was not a nihilist. He is constantly, lazily called one, and it is the opposite of the truth. He diagnosed nihilism the way a physician diagnoses a fever, as a dangerous condition he wanted to cure. Nihilism, in his sense, is what happens when the old sources of meaning collapse and nothing takes their place, so that a person or a whole culture comes to feel, somewhere underneath the daily routine, that nothing really matters, that no goal is worth more than any other, that striving is pointless, and the honest response is a shrug. And he drew a distinction inside that condition which is going to matter a great deal for everything we talk about tonight. There is passive nihilism, which is a decline, an exhaustion of the spirit, a sinking into comfort and distraction and small pleasures, because you no longer believe anything is worth the effort of reaching for. And there is active nihilism, which takes the very same collapse of old values and treats it as a demolition site, a cleared space where something new can finally be built. The passive nihilist looks at the empty horizon and orders another snack. The active nihilist looks at the same horizon and starts drawing. Hold on to that fork in the road. We are going to see both of these responses walking around a small undersea town for the next few hours. Because the death of God, for Nietzsche, opened onto a choice, and the choice is the beating center of the whole thing. Down one path is the figure he called the Übermensch, a word that gets translated as the overman or the superman, and that has been dragged through so much mud that I almost hesitate to use it. Set aside every comic book and every propaganda poster you have ever seen, because none of it is what he meant. The Übermensch is not a master race, and not a blonde warrior, and not a person who dominates other people. It is an individual who, standing over that same empty horizon, does not despair and does not run for comfort, but instead creates values, invents meaning, says a full-throated yes to this life exactly as it is, with all its suffering included, and becomes the author of his own existence, rather than the inheritor of someone else's. Man, Nietzsche wrote, is something that shall be overcome. He meant that the human being, as it currently exists, is a bridge to something higher, and that the work of a life is the crossing. And down the other path, the path he was truly afraid we would take, is the figure this entire video is named after, though we have not said his name yet. Nietzsche called him the last man. We will spend a long time with the last man tonight, so for now I will only open the door. The last man is the human being who, faced with the loss of all the old meaning, decides that the honest and reasonable thing to do is to stop reaching for anything at all. He wants comfort. He wants safety. He wants a little pleasure in the day and a little pleasure in the night, and no great risk and no great love and no great striving and, above all, no pain. He has, in Nietzsche's phrase, invented happiness, and he blinks. That blink is one of the most chilling images in all of philosophy, and we will come back to it. The last man is not evil. He is not cruel. He is comfortable and small, and he does not know that anything has been lost. And Nietzsche believed he was the most likely thing for modern people to become, and the hardest thing in the world to argue anyone out of, because the last man is by his own measure perfectly content. Now I have to make the turn from the philosopher to the sponge, and I want to make it honestly rather than forcing it, because a forced comparison would insult both of them. So let me tell you who built Bikini Bottom, because the man who built it is a stranger fit for this story than you might expect. SpongeBob SquarePants was created by a man named Steven Hillenburg, and before he was an animator, he was a marine biology teacher. That is not a fun fact footnote. It is the key to the whole design of the show. Hillenburg studied the ocean, taught it to children at a place called the Ocean Institute on the California coast, and in the late 1980s he drew a small educational comic to help him teach, a tide pool comic called The Intertidal Zone, hosted by a talkative character who was a real, natural sea sponge, and who went by the name Bob the Sponge. That comic was never really published. It sat in a drawer, but it carried the seed of everything. A scientist's genuine love of the strange creatures in the shallows, dressed up in jokes so that children would listen. Years later, after studying experimental animation and working on another cartoon, Hillenburg pulled that sponge back out of the drawer, squared him off into the shape of a kitchen sponge so that audiences would actually recognize him, and Bikini Bottom was born. I find that origin genuinely moving, and here is why it matters for tonight. Underneath the fart jokes and the screaming, SpongeBob is built on a real and orderly vision of the sea. The show is, at its foundation, a biologist's cosmos, a place where the animals are almost accurate. SpongeBob's true species, for instance, is a real animal, a yellow tube sponge called Aplacina fistularis that grows on Caribbean reefs, and it really is that bright, cheerful yellow, even though the actual creature is shaped like a cluster of tubes and looks nothing at all like a kitchen sponge. There is, in other words, a careful, rational, form-loving mind at the bottom of this chaotic little world. Keep that in your pocket, because one of the arguments we are going to test tonight is that Bikini Bottom is a place where a deep order and a deep disorder are constantly rubbing against each other, and that this friction is the engine of nearly every character we love. I should say plainly what kind of claim I am making and where I am going to be honest with you every step of the way, because this topic is a minefield for exactly the kind of confident nonsense that ruins a video like this. When I tell you something happens in the show, I will try only to tell you what genuinely happens, and I will try to anchor it. When I tell you what it means when I read a crab or a sponge as an illustration of some idea, I am giving you an interpretation, my interpretation, and the interpretation of a fair number of writers who have wandered down this same road, and I will mark it as a reading rather than dressing it up as a fact. And when I drift into the theories that fans have spun around the show, I will tell you flatly that they are theories. The show is more than 25 years old now. As of the last couple of years, it officially became the longest-running American animated series ever made, overtaking a show about an aardvark that had held the record for a long time, and a quarter of a century of a thing that beloved generates an enormous amount of legend, some of it true and much of it invented. I will try never to hand you the invented parts as though they were real. With all of that said, let me take you down into the town itself, because before we can ask whether SpongeBob is the last man, we have to look at the place he lives. And the place he lives was, quite literally, built on top of a hole in the world. Bikini Bottom sits, in the show's own geography, at the bottom of the sea, beneath a real place. A ring of coral in the Pacific, called Bikini Atoll, out in the Marshall Islands. The name itself has a quiet history that almost nobody who says the word ever knows. It comes from the Marshallese name for the island, Bikini, which is a compound of a word meaning surface and a word meaning coconut, and it drifted into English as bikini because the sound at the front, the soft p and the soft b, are made with the lips in almost the same way, and speakers slide between them without noticing. That is the gentle version of the island's history. Here is the other version, and it is not gentle at all. Between 1946 and 1958, the United States detonated 67 nuclear weapons at Bikini Atoll. The people who lived there were moved off their home and never truly got it back. And one of those detonations, a hydrogen bomb tested on the 1st of March 1954 under the name Castle Bravo, was so much larger than its designers expected that it became the worst radiological accident in American history, a blast on the order of 1,000 times the bomb that fell on Hiroshima. That is the real ground, the real seabed, that a children's cartoon about a laughing sponge was placed on top of. For a long time this was treated as a dark coincidence, or as fan trivia, until it drifted into something more. There is a well-known fan theory that the talking, walking, mutated sea creatures of Bikini Bottom are the way they are because of that radiation, that the whole cheerful town is a colony of things twisted into new shapes by the bombs above them. I want to be careful here, because this is exactly the kind of claim that gets a video like this filled with corrections. Nothing in any episode's dialogue says this. It has never been stated on screen. What did happen, and this was widely reported a couple of years ago, is that a longtime writer on the show acknowledged the connection, more or less admitted that the radioactive reading was baked into the joke of the setting from the start. So I will give it to you at exactly that weight and no heavier. A longtime writer has acknowledged it. The episodes have never said it. Take it as a wink from the people who made the show, not as a line of canon. And yet, hold the picture in your mind, because whether or not you buy the radiation theory, the plain fact of the geography is almost too on the nose for our purposes tonight. Here is a town of small, contented creatures, going to their little jobs and eating their little burgers and worrying about their little worries, and directly above them, in the world they never look up at, is among the most violent things human beings have ever done to a place. A paradise of comfort sitting on top of a catastrophe it has completely forgotten. If you wanted to build a visual illustration of Nietzsche's warning, of a civilization living cheerfully in the crater, left by something enormous that it no longer remembers losing, you could not do much better than to draw a friendly suburb on the floor of a nuclear test site and never once let the residents notice. Now I want to slow down and actually describe the last man properly, because I only cracked the door on him before, and he deserves the full portrait. The last man arrives in the very first pages of Nietzsche's strangest and most important book, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, published in parts across the middle of the 1880s. In the story, a prophet named Zarathustra comes down from 10 years alone in the mountains, full of a gift he cannot wait to give to humanity, and he walks into a town marketplace and tries to tell the crowd about the Übermensch, about the great and difficult project of overcoming themselves and becoming something higher. And the crowd is bored. They laugh at him. So Zarathustra, stung, tries a different approach. He decides to frighten them by describing the opposite of everything he has just praised. He describes the most despicable creature he can imagine, the human being who has stopped striving entirely, and he calls it the last man. Listen to what he says the last man is like. The last man has his little pleasure for the day and his little pleasure for the night. He no longer becomes poor or rich, because both are too much trouble. He wants no ruling and no obeying, because both are too much trouble. He avoids anything that is hard. He has a regard for health above all things. He still works, because work is entertainment, but he takes care that the entertainment does not exhaust him. He no longer has any great longing, any great love, any great contempt, any star he steers by. He has, as Nietzsche writes it, invented happiness, and when he says the word he blinks, that small, self-satisfied flutter of the eyes of a creature who is comfortable and knows nothing of what he has traded away for the comfort. And here is the twist that most people never hear. The twist that makes The Last Man genuinely one of the most frightening ideas Nietzsche ever had. Zarathustra describes this creature expecting the crowd to recoil in disgust. Instead, the crowd is delighted. They interrupt him. They beg him. They cry out, "Give us this last man. Make us into these last men, and we will make you a gift of the Übermensch. We do not want your overman. We want the comfort." The prophet came to warn them, and they heard an advertisement. That is the real horror of the passage. Not that the last man exists, but that when a whole society is shown a clear picture of a small, safe, painless, unremarkable life, with no risk and no greatness in it, the society says, "Yes, please, that is exactly what we would like to order." Nietzsche did not think the last man would be forced on us by a tyrant. He thought we would ask for him. He thought we would vote for him. He thought we would build a comfortable little town and move in gratefully, and never wonder what was above the water. Read Bikini Bottom through that passage and it becomes uncomfortably exact. This is a town organized entirely around small pleasures. The great civic event, the thing everyone in the show wants, is a sandwich. When something like real excitement passes through, it usually passes through as a consumer frenzy, a run on a product, a stampede for chocolate, or for the newest toy, a whole street of citizens whipped into a lather over a small thing to buy. Nothing that happens in Bikini Bottom is ever truly at stake. The residents want their health, their routine, their entertainment that does not exhaust them, and their little poison now and then for pleasant dreams, which is the exact phrase Nietzsche uses for the last man's relationship to his own pleasures. Read this way. The entire town is the marketplace crowd from Zarathustra, the ones who cheered, the ones who asked to be made small. And they got their wish so completely that they cannot even conceive of having wished otherwise. That is the argument, at least, and I find it hard to shake once you have seen it. The look of the town reinforces the reading, and here the making of the show turns out to be quietly perfect. The visual world of Bikini Bottom was designed under a strict rule that everything had to look nautical, that the background artists were required to build the world out of a fixed vocabulary of rope and wooden planks and ship's wheels and netting and anchors and rivets, houses made from ship's smokestacks and thatch. Everything a little mushy and lumpy and handmade, rather than sharp and symmetrical. And the sky, if you have ever looked at it, is full of soft, floating shapes that most viewers read as clouds. They are not clouds. One of the background designers has explained that those shapes were drawn to evoke the flowers on a Hawaiian shirt, an influence the creator picked up from a trip to Tahiti, which is why the whole painted world leans so heavily into that soft tiki pattern. So even the sky over the last man's town is a decoration, a vacation print, a holiday shirt stretched across the top of the world. There is a warmth to it that is genuinely lovely, and there is also, if you are in the mood to see it, something a little sedative about a sky made of resort wallpaper. It is worth pausing on how much care went into that warmth, because the care is real. The very first season of the show was hand-painted the old way, real acrylic and gouache on paper, later scanned into a computer, and everything from the year 2000 onward was made digitally instead, which is why those original first-season backgrounds are now treated as genuine art objects and have been sold at auction houses. A room full of artists mixed actual paint to build a soft, hand-touched, deeply comfortable little universe. And the comfort of it is not an accident, and it is not a criticism. It is the point of the design. The show wants you to feel safe there. It wants Bikini Bottom to feel like the warmest, roundest, most forgiving place a tired person could possibly sink into at the end of a long day, which, if you happen to be watching this to fall asleep, is a thing you are experiencing right now. And that is precisely what makes the Nietzschean reading bite. The Last Man's world is not supposed to look like a dystopia. It is supposed to look like exactly this. Warm, round, soft, painless. A place you would happily move into and never leave. Now, the deepest thing about Bikini Bottom as a town of the last man is not the sandwiches and not the sky. It is the way time works there, and I only want to sketch it now because it deserves a full chapter of its own later on. The show runs on what fans and critics call negative continuity. Episodes mostly do not build on each other. A character can be turned into a snail. The entire town can be flooded or frozen or blown to pieces. Someone can die. And by the next episode, it is all simply undone. The status quo snaps back into place. Nobody has aged. Nobody remembers. And the same Tuesday begins again. This is not lazy writing. It is a deliberate law of the show's universe. And it means that Bikini Bottom is a place where nothing can ever be permanently gained, and nothing can ever be permanently lost. Where no growth sticks, and no catastrophe leaves a mark. Where every leap forward is quietly erased before the next episode, so that the town can begin again unchanged. For a society of last men, that is not a bug, that is heaven. It is the guarantee that nothing will ever be demanded of them, that no change will ever be forced on them, that tomorrow will be exactly as safe and exactly as small as today. We will come back to what that machinery does to a life. For now, just notice that the town is built so that nothing ever has to be overcome. I want to end this stretch on something that happened very recently, because it says something about how the world outside the show keeps trying to smooth the show down into something even flatter. In the summer of 2026, a Russian television channel that airs SpongeBob digitally altered one of its images. In the original scene, part of an old imagination gag, SpongeBob makes a rainbow with his hands. On the Russian broadcast, the rainbow was quietly repainted into a plain, single-color yellow arc in order to comply with the country's laws against so-called gay propaganda, even though the rainbow in that scene was never about anything at all except a sponge imagining things. Feel the strangeness of that for a second. A cartoon rainbow, drawn purely to represent the free play of a childlike imagination, sanded down into a flat yellow curve so that it would offend no one and mean nothing. If you were looking for a tiny, perfect emblem of what Nietzsche feared, of a world so devoted to avoiding discomfort that it will erase the colors out of an imaginary rainbow rather than risk a single hard feeling, you could hardly invent a better one than a true story from this very year. The Last Man does not burn the rainbow. He just repaints it a safe color, and blinks, and moves on. And with the town sketched, we can finally walk up to the yellow creature standing in the middle of it and ask the question the whole video is built around. Here is the question, as plainly as I can put it. Is SpongeBob SquarePants the perfect last man? Or is he secretly the one creature in the whole ocean who has done the impossible thing Nietzsche hoped a human being might one day do? I genuinely do not think this has a clean answer, and I think the fact that it does not is the most interesting thing about the character. So let me argue both sides as hard as I can and let you drift off somewhere in the middle. Start with the case for the last man, because it is overwhelming and it is the first thing anyone sees. SpongeBob has a job as a fry cook at a fast food restaurant, and he loves it. Not tolerates it, loves it. He wakes up every single morning really thrilled to go and fry the same sandwich he fried yesterday and the day before, and for every day of a working life, that in the show's own logic has no end and no promotion waiting at the end of it. He shouts that he is ready. He has an alarm clock and a foghorn and a whole ritual of enthusiasm for the beginning of another identical shift. He does not want a better job. He does not want Mr. Krabs' job. He does not dream of leaving Bikini Bottom, or of becoming anything other than exactly what he already is. His ambitions, such as they are, run entirely inward, toward being an even better fry cook, toward employee of the month, toward the approval of a boss who is openly exploiting him. Line that up against Nietzsche's Last Man, and it matches almost point for point. He still works, but the work is a joy that never exhausts him. He has his little pleasures. He wants no ruling and no obeying beyond the tiny hierarchy of his kitchen. He has no great longing to be more than he is. He has, by every visible measure, invented happiness, and he beams. You can even find the mechanical detail that seals it, if you want to be a little cruel about it. There is a running thread in the show where an older fry cook, a character who warns SpongeBob that he cannot lean on the Krusty Krab forever, that a person should want something more than this, something beyond the grill, and SpongeBob truly cannot understand the warning. The idea that his happy repetition might be a kind of trap does not compute for him, because from the inside it does not feel like a trap at all. It feels like a life fully lived. That is the last man exactly. Not a person who has been forced into a small life, but a person for whom the smallness is invisible, because the contentment is total. Nietzsche's fear was never that people would be enslaved into mediocrity against their will. It was that they would choose it, defend it, and be honestly baffled by anyone who suggested there was anything else worth wanting. SpongeBob, read this way, is that fear animated in bright yellow. And there is something almost eerie about how deeply the contentment is built into the very body of the character, because of a small production fact that I love. When the animators were first working out how SpongeBob should move, one of the board artists threw out the planned motion and instead based the character's stiff, marching, endlessly eager walk on an impression of Steven Hillenburg himself, on the creator's own real physical mannerisms, the way he carried himself, the way he gestured. The crew studied the man and poured him into the sponge. So the relentless forward march of SpongeBob, that bouncy, determined little stride toward another day of the same, is literally the body language of the person who dreamed him up. There is a warmth in that which cuts against the cold reading, and we will need it in a minute, but for now, just notice how total the design of contentment is. It goes all the way down into how the creature walks. Now let me turn the whole thing over, because the other reading is just as strong, and it is, honestly, the one I find myself believing on my better days. What if SpongeBob is not the last man at all? What if he is the opposite, the thing Nietzsche was reaching toward and could barely describe? Because there is a concept we have not fully unpacked yet, and it is the hinge the entire character swings on. Nietzsche's word for it was amor fati, the love of fate. It appears in his notebooks and his books as a kind of personal motto, a formula for greatness. He wrote that he wanted to learn more and more to see as beautiful what is necessary in things, so that he would be one of those who make things beautiful, and that he wanted, on the whole and in the end, to be a person who says yes, a yes-sayer. Amor fati is not resignation. It is not gritting your teeth and enduring. It is not the Stoics' calm acceptance of what cannot be changed. It is something much harder and much stranger. It is actively loving your fate, wanting nothing about your life to be different, not the past, not the present, not the future, not even the suffering, and willing all of it again with joy. Nietzsche thought this was close to the highest thing a person could achieve, and he thought it was almost impossibly rare. Look at SpongeBob again through that lens, and the whole picture inverts. The last man loves his small life because he is too dull to imagine a larger one. But SpongeBob does not seem dull in that way. He seems to actually, ecstatically, wholeheartedly love the exact life he has. The frying, the friends, the jellyfish, the same square patch of the same ocean, and to want nothing else. Not because he cannot conceive of more, but because more is not what he is after. He is a yes-sayer, in the purest form the show can draw. He wills the eternal return of his own ordinary Tuesday, and he does it laughing. And this is the knife edge that makes him such a rich character. The difference between the last man and the person who has achieved amor fati is not what they do. Both of them love their small repeating lives. The difference is entirely on the inside. The last man's contentment is an anesthetic, a numbness that has never once asked the hard question of whether life is worth it. The lover of fate's contentment is an answer, a yes given with full awareness of everything that could make a person say no. And the show, maddeningly, wonderfully, never tells you which one SpongeBob is. It just shows you a creature who is completely happy and lets you decide whether that happiness is the shallowest thing in the ocean or the deepest. I lean toward the deeper reading, and I will tell you why, though I want to mark this clearly as my interpretation and not as anything the show declares. SpongeBob suffers. Not constantly, but really. He fails, over and over, at the one goal he actually chases, which is passing his boating test, and I will come back to that failure at length later, because it is a rare, quietly profound gag in the whole show. He is mocked, exploited, terrified, left out, and put through genuine misery in episode after episode. And he keeps saying yes. A creature who had simply never encountered suffering could be dismissed as a naive last man, comfortable only because nothing hard has ever reached him. But SpongeBob has been reached by hard things again and again, and his joy survives all of them, resets with him, comes back every morning undimmed. That looks less like numbness to me and more like a strange kind of courage. That looks like a creature who has been shown every reason to curse his fate and chooses, each time, to love it anyway. I should be honest about how slippery the character is on the level of plain fact, because the show itself refuses to pin him down, and that refusal is part of the point. Take something as simple as how old he is. There is a long-running gag where SpongeBob's boating license lists his date of birth, and the date given is July 14th, 1986. A joke first planted in a first-season dream sequence and then paid off on the license a season later. If you take that literally, it would make him only about 13 years old when the show first aired, which collides head-on with the fact that he lives alone, holds a job, and pays what amounts to a mortgage on his home. Hillenburg's own position on this was simply that SpongeBob has no fixed age, that he is however old the joke needs him to be, and that trying to nail it down misses the character, which is itself a little bit of a Nietzschean move if you like. Here is a creature outside of ordinary time, who does not age, whose birthday is a gag rather than a fact, who exists in a permanent present. The last man is a creature of comfort, but the being who has truly overcome the fear of death and change might also live in a kind of eternal present, and the show, without meaning to, keeps its central figure floating exactly between those two possibilities. Even his relationships resist the tidy timeline, which I think fits him. The show cannot even keep its story straight about how SpongeBob met his best friend. In one episode, it is firmly established that SpongeBob and Patrick have been best friends since they were babies, since they met in the hospital as infants. In another, we see an adult SpongeBob moving in next door to Bikini Bottom as if newly arriving, greeting Patrick like someone he is meeting for the first time, even while already knowing his name. The two accounts flatly contradict each other, and the show has never bothered to reconcile them, because in a world of negative continuity, where nothing accumulates, a stable origin story is beside the point. He simply is who he is, right now, forever, with no settled past behind him and no future ahead of him, different from the present, which, depending on how you tilt your head, is either the emptiest way to exist or the freest. There is one last small thing I want to give you about the very beginning of the show, because it is a lovely detail, and it says something about how contingent all of this warmth was. The pilot episode, the one that introduces SpongeBob getting his job at the Krusty Krab, was for years quietly missing from the first season DVD, and the reason had nothing to do with the story. The episode featured an old song performed by the singer Tiny Tim, and Nickelodeon simply refused to pay Tiny Tim's estate the license fee to include it on the disc, so they pulled the entire pilot from the release rather than pay. And the small heartbreak of it is that the same pilot had already spent its entire music budget on that one song in the first place. The very first steps of this enormous, record-breaking, quarter-century phenomenon were nearly left in a drawer over a licensing bill, the way the whole thing started as a comic in a drawer years before. I find that oddly comforting, the reminder that the warmest cultural objects we have are held together with tape and luck and somebody deciding, or almost not deciding, to pay for a song. But we have spent long enough with the happy one. To really understand what SpongeBob's contentment means, we have to spend time with the one creature in Bikini Bottom who cannot stand it. The one who sees exactly what the town is and hates every soft yellow inch of it. Squidward Tentacles is, for my money, the most tragic figure in the entire show, and he is tragic in a way that is almost purely Nietzschean, so I am going to take my time with him across this stretch and the next. First, a couple of small facts to clear away, because people get them wrong constantly, and it matters for how you see him. Squidward is not a squid. He is an octopus, despite the name, and he was drawn with only 6 limbs instead of the 8 a real octopus has, for the very simple reason that 6 were easier to animate than 8. Hillenburg chose an octopus specifically for the bulbous, dome-like head, that heavy drooping cranium that gives Squidward his whole air of exhausted superiority, and the name Squidward stuck only because the more accurate alternative, something like Octaward, sounded wrong to the ear. So the character's very name is a small lie he carries around, a squid's name on an octopus's body, which is almost too fitting for a creature whose entire being is a gap between what he is called and what he actually is. In the Latin American dub, by the way, they gave him a name I have always loved, Calamardo, a blend of the Spanish word for squid and the name Eduardo, and in the German dub he is Thaddeus, a name so established over there that when the show later introduced a minor background character actually named Thaddeus, the German version had to rename that fellow entirely to avoid the collision. The point of all this is that Squidward is a character defined, right down to his name across languages, by a mismatch between the label and the substance. And that mismatch is the seed of everything, because Squidward believes he is a great artist. He plays the clarinet, he paints, he considers himself a refined, sophisticated aesthete trapped among idiots, a man of taste marooned in a town of fry cooks and starfish. He dreams of fame, of recognition, of a life in which the world finally acknowledges his genius. And the cruelest, most important fact about him, the fact the entire show is built on, is that he is not actually very good. His clarinet playing is painful. His paintings, self-portraits mostly, are the work of an enthusiastic amateur. The gap between the greatness he feels inside himself and the mediocrity he actually produces is the exact size of his misery. And that gap has a name in Nietzsche, among the most piercing ideas the man ever developed. And once you see Squidward through it, you cannot unsee it. The word is Ressentiment. Let me explain it properly, because it is easy to get wrong, and it is not the same as ordinary resentment. In one of his most important books, On the Genealogy of Morality, published in 1887, Nietzsche tried to trace where our moral ideas actually came from, where we got the words good and evil, and he told a story, a genealogy, that goes roughly like this. Once, he said, the words for good were coined by the strong, the noble, the powerful, the flourishing, who looked at their own lives, full of strength and health and confidence, and simply called that good, and called what was low and weak and sickly bad, almost as an afterthought, without much interest in it. This he called master morality, the morality of people who affirm themselves. But there is another way to make values, and it grows in the opposite soil, among the weak, the powerless, the ones who cannot get what the strong have, and cannot become what the strong are. A poison begins to build. They cannot act on their envy, they cannot take revenge, they are helpless, and so the feeling turns inward and festers and becomes creative in a twisted way. It reimagines the whole scoreboard. It says, the strong are not good, the strong are evil, and we, the meek, the humble, the ones who do not act and do not triumph, we are the good ones. Our weakness is not weakness, it is virtue. Our failure to act is not failure, it is patience. Our inability to take is not impotence, it is kindness. That festering, creative, inverted envy, that turning of one's own smallness into a badge of superiority, so that one never has to face the smallness directly, is ressentiment. And it is, Nietzsche thought, one of the great engines of human self-deception. Now watch Squidward. He cannot achieve the artistic greatness he longs for. He cannot make the world admire him. He is stuck at a cash register, taking orders from a sponge he considers beneath him, and a crab he considers a Philistine. And what does he do with that unbearable gap? He does exactly what ressentiment does. He reframes it. The reason he is unrecognized is not that his art is mediocre. It is that the world is full of idiots, too coarse to appreciate real sophistication. The reason SpongeBob is happy and he is not is not that SpongeBob has found something Squidward has missed. It is that SpongeBob is a simpleton, and only a simpleton could be happy in a world this crude, so his own misery becomes proof of his own refinement. His suffering is not a problem to be solved. It is the evidence of his superiority. He would rather be a miserable genius unrecognized by fools than admit the possibility that he is a comfortable mediocrity like everyone around him. That is Ressentiment in its purest cartoon form. It is the alchemy that turns "I have failed" into "they are unworthy of me." And it is the exact machine that keeps Squidward locked in his own unhappiness, because a person who explains his misery as the price of his superiority has no reason to ever change. Why would he grow? Growth would mean admitting there was somewhere to grow too. And here is where the reading gets sad, because Nietzsche's point about Ressentiment was never that these people are villains, they are wounded. The whole apparatus of Ressentiment is a defense against a pain almost too large to bear, the pain of confronting your own limits. Squidward is not evil. He is in agony, and he has built an elaborate philosophy of taste and sophistication whose only real function is to protect him from ever having to look directly at the thing that hurts, which is that he wanted to be great and he is not, and he does not know how to make peace with that. Read this way. Squidward's arrogance is not the opposite of his sadness. It is his sadness, dressed up so that he can survive it. Every time he sneers at SpongeBob's simple joy, he is running from his own despair. The sneer is the bandage. The town's philistinism is, of course, partly real, and this is what makes him such a rich figure, rather than a simple butt of the joke. Bikini Bottom Real is a place with no room for greatness, a place of last men who want their patty and their routine and nothing higher. Squidward is, in a certain sense, right about them. He is the one resident who perceives that the town is spiritually empty, that everyone around him has traded the possibility of anything grand for the certainty of comfort. He sees the crater the others have forgotten, and this is the deep tragedy Nietzsche identified, the reason Ressentiment is a trap and not just a bad mood. Squidward has the perception of a higher person and none of the power. He can see that the herd is a herd. He just cannot become anything other than a bitter member of it. He has the diagnosis and none of the cure. He is awake in a town of sleepers, and being awake has brought him nothing but the ability to catalog exactly how much he is suffering. Perception without creation. That is his prison, and we will see next what it does to a soul over the long run. I want to give you two small, strange production details about Squidward here, because they orbit this theme of the character in ways I find oddly perfect. The first is that in the very early days of the show, in an episode introducing Plankton, there was originally a shot of Squidward with no clothes on, entirely naked, which was cut before the episode ever aired. It is a tiny thing, a piece of trivia from a commentary track, but there is something almost poignant about it, in light of everything we have just said, the idea that the show once briefly stripped this most self-protected, most heavily armored character, completely bare, and then thought better of it, and covered him back up. Squidward is a creature who cannot bear to be exposed, whose entire personality is a set of coverings, and the show itself decided, early on, that we should not see him naked. The second detail is stranger, and comes much later. In one episode built around SpongeBob wandering through a series of surreal doors, an early broadcast version included a door that opened onto a creepy, flashing image of Squidward, an image that was a deliberate joke, a mockery of a famous piece of internet horror fiction that fans had spun around the character years earlier, a fake so-called lost episode about a suicidal Squidward. The show's writers put that flashing Squidward in, specifically to poke fun at what they saw as try-hard, edgy fan fiction, and then the network's standards department pulled it back out. I mention it partly because it is a good moment to say something clearly. There is an entire genre of internet horror stories about SpongeBob, the so-called lost episodes, the Red Mist tapes and the rest of them, and every last one of them is fan fiction. They are made-up creepypasta, not real leaked footage, and I will not be treating any of them as real tonight, because they are not. What is real, and what interests me, is that the character fans chose to build their darkest fantasies around was Squidward. Not the villain, not Plankton, the sad, unrecognized, suffering artist. Some part of the audience looked at Bikini Bottom and understood, correctly, that if a real horror lived anywhere in that bright little town, it lived behind the eyes of the one creature who could see the emptiness and could not escape it. That instinct, I think, is exactly right, even though the stories built on it are invented. Which brings us to the 2 episodes where the show itself, in its own canon, took Squidward all the way down into the abyss. The first is an early one in which Squidward, driven to the edge by SpongeBob and Patrick's noise, accidentally freezes himself and wakes up 2,000 years in the future. Finding that future unbearable in its own way, he tries to travel back, overshoots into a prehistoric past, and eventually lands somewhere else entirely, a place with no features at all, an endless white nothing stretching in every direction, and he says, with a kind of exhausted relief, that he is finally alone at last, and then the loneliness of it starts to press on him. There is no one there. There is nothing there. It is a void, a blank, the absence of everything, and the show holds him in it long enough that the joke curdles into something unsettling, a creature who spent his whole life wishing everyone would leave him alone, getting his wish so completely that it becomes a kind of hell. Nietzsche would recognize that void immediately. It is the abyss, the blank left behind when the old meanings are gone, the thing the madman was pointing at when he asked who gave us the sponge to wipe away the horizon. And the deep joke of the episode is that Squidward, the town's one skeptic, the one who most despises the warm herd around him, cannot survive the very emptiness he thought he wanted. He begged to be free of other people, and the freedom turned out to be a white room, with no walls and no door and no one, and he could not stand it. There is also, threaded through that same episode, a small loop in time, a causal circle, where it turns out that Squidward himself, in his frantic time traveling, is the one who accidentally invented the pastime the whole town loves, so that the misanthrope who hates their happiness is secretly its source. A little eternal recurrence in miniature, a snake eating its own tail, planted in one of the earliest episodes the show ever made. The second episode is the one that, if you only watched a single scene to understand Squidward's whole soul, you might choose. In it, Squidward finally escapes Bikini Bottom for a gated community built entirely for creatures like him, a suburb of identical, comfortable, sophisticated octopuses, all living in identical houses, all sharing his exact refined tastes, all doing the same clean, quiet, civilized things. It is, on paper, his paradise. It is the town he always said he wanted, purged of the fry cooks and the starfish and the noise, a place of nothing but people like him, and he is happy there for about a day, and then the sameness starts to close in. Everyone is identical. Every house is identical. Every activity is the same activity performed by the same kind of creature in the same tasteful way, forever. And Squidward slowly realizes that a community with no friction, no difference, no chaos, no idiot next door blowing bubbles, is not heaven at all. It is a beautifully decorated tomb, he goes, by the end, a little mad with the emptiness of it, and flees back to the loud, imperfect, maddening town he came from. I cannot think of a cleaner illustration of Nietzsche's idea of the herd than that gated community of identical octopuses. Nietzsche argued that conventional morality functions as a herd instinct, that it prizes conformity and safety and sameness above all, that it distrusts the exceptional individual precisely because the exceptional are dangerous to the comfort of the group, and that a society optimized entirely for that comfort becomes a place where nothing higher can grow, because everything higher gets flattened back down into the average. The octopus suburb is the herd made literal, rows of the same creature living the same life, and the show's genius is that it makes even Squidward, the arch-individualist, recoil from it. Because Squidward did not actually want to be alone with people exactly like himself. What he wanted, though he could never say it, was to be recognized as exceptional. And you cannot be exceptional in a town where everyone is you. The herd of the sophisticated is still a herd, and in fleeing it, Squidward reveals that his contempt for Bikini Bottom was never really the whole of him. Some part of him needs the friction, needs the yellow idiot next door, needs a world with something in it other than mirrors. That is the closest the show ever comes to letting him understand himself. And of course, by the next episode, the reset wipes it all away and he is a bitter cashier again, having learned nothing, because the machinery of the show does not allow him to keep what he learns. Now I want to bring in the other half of the Nietzschean frame for Squidward, because it deepens everything, and it comes from the very first book Nietzsche ever published, back in 1872, The Birth of Tragedy. In it he argued that great art, and really all of life, is a struggle and a marriage between two forces he named after two Greek gods. On one side is the Apollonian, named for Apollo, the principle of order, form, boundary, clarity, reason, individuation, the beautiful dream, the sculpture, the clean line. On the other side is the Dionysian, named for Dionysus, the god of wine and ecstasy, the principle of chaos, intoxication, music, dissolution, the loss of the self, the crowd that becomes one body, the dance that forgets where it began. Nietzsche thought that the greatest art, Greek tragedy above all, happened when these two forces fused, when Apollonian form gave shape to Dionysian energy, when order contained ecstasy without killing it. And he thought a person who had only one of them was crippled. Pure order with no ecstasy is sterile. Pure ecstasy with no order is formless noise. Look at Squidward now, and he snaps into focus as the frustrated Apollonian. Everything he loves is form, order, refinement, the clean, disciplined line of the clarinet, the composed portrait, the tasteful house, the elegant gesture. He craves beautiful form. And he lives next door to two creatures who are pure Dionysian abandon, SpongeBob and Patrick, all laughter and noise and self-forgetting joy, blowing bubbles, jellyfishing, dissolving into pleasure with no form at all. And Squidward's tragedy, in Nietzsche's exact terms, is that he rejects the very energy that could have brought his art to life. He has all the Apollonian longing for form, and none of the Dionysian fire to fill it. And because he despises the fire that surrounds him, sees it only as an annoyance to be shut out, his form stays empty, his clarinet stays screeching, his paintings stay lifeless. He wants the sculpture without the god inside it. And the two idiots next door are carrying, in their absurd abandon, exactly the thing his art is starving for, and he cannot see it, because he is too busy being superior to them, which is what makes the one time it comes together the emotional peak of the entire series. There is an episode, and it is beloved by fans above almost any other, in which Squidward, having bragged to an old rival about leading a marvelous band, is suddenly forced to turn a room full of the town's hopeless, tone-deaf citizens into a real marching band in almost no time, to avoid total humiliation. It is a disaster all the way through rehearsal. And then, on the night of the performance, rallied and organized by SpongeBob, the chaotic herd of untalented townsfolk somehow comes together and plays, and what comes out is not a screeching mess but a genuine, soaring, triumphant rock anthem, and Squidward, for once in his life, conducts something magnificent, and gets the recognition he has spent the whole show aching for. And in Nietzschean terms, look at what actually happened in that room. The Apollonian ambition, Squidward's craving for form and glory, finally fused with the Dionysian energy of the crowd. The chaotic collective force of the whole town rallied by the most Dionysian creature in it. And for a few minutes, the two principles that had been at war for the entire series united, and the result was transcendent. That is not a coincidence of the plot. That is, whether the writers meant it or not, the exact structure Nietzsche said produced great art. Order and ecstasy, married at last. For one night, Squidward was not the man of ressentiment sneering at the herd. He was the artist who let the herd's raw energy pour through his form, and he touched the greatness he had always believed was his. And then, because this is a show that runs on the reset, it was gone. By the next episode, Squidward was back at his register, mediocre and bitter, the triumph erased like everything else. No memory of it carried forward, the status quo restored. That single arc, the failed artist who for one impossible night achieves the sublime, and then has it wiped from the world as if it never happened, is, I would argue, the whole Nietzschean drama of the show, compressed into one episode. The height a creature can reach when order and chaos fuse, and the cruelty of a universe built to make sure that height never lasts. There are a couple of things about that famous anthem that make the whole story even richer once you know them, and they are true, and I love them. The episode itself was born from failure, which is almost too perfect. The writers had originally been trying, over and over, to give SpongeBob a rival character, and it kept not working. The idea would not come to life. So they gave up on making the rival SpongeBob's and handed him to Squidward instead, and that is how Squidward got the smug old bandleader he is trying to impress. The head writer has said that the episode is, in some ways, really Squidward's story, and the show's single greatest triumph exists only because a SpongeBob idea failed and got repurposed. The show's high point grew directly out of a dead end, which is a very Nietzschean way for a thing to be born. And the song itself, the anthem the band plays, has a real-world life stranger than the episode. It is a genuine rock song, written in the late 1990s by a singer named David Glenn Isley, who had fronted a 1980s rock band, and co-written and produced by a guitarist named Bob Kulick, a session player who worked with Kiss and with Meatloaf, who won a Grammy, and who was the older brother of one of Kiss's lead guitarists. The song existed years before it ever touched SpongeBob, and then, after the show's creator died and the football halftime show paid tribute to him, there was such an outpouring of feeling for that anthem that the real song charted, for real, on the Billboard rock charts, more than 20 years after it was first recorded. A piece of music written for the world of grown-up rock stadiums found its true immortality inside a cartoon about a sponge, and then leapt back out into the real charts on a wave of grief. Squidward's one moment of transcendence, it turns out, was carried by a song that had its own quiet miracle waiting. Before I leave Squidward, I have to give you the line, because it is real dialogue and it is the single most nakedly philosophical thing anyone says in the entire show. In a moment of despair, Squidward lays out the shape of his life with total clarity. He orders the food, the customer gets the food. They do that, he says, for 40 years, and then they die. That is it. That is the whole thing. It is almost word for word the problem the French writer Albert Camus built an entire philosophy around. The image of a man condemned to repeat the same meaningless labor forever. The myth of Sisyphus pushing his rock up the hill only to watch it roll back down for eternity. And I want to be careful to keep Camus and Nietzsche distinct, because they are cousins and not twins, and it would be sloppy to blur them. Camus named the absurd, the confrontation between our hunger for meaning and a universe that offers none, and asked whether we could be happy anyway. Nietzsche came earlier and asked the harder version, whether we could not merely endure the endless repetition but love it. But Squidward stands at the exact crossroads of both of them. He has seen, more clearly than anyone in Bikini Bottom, that his life is a meaningless repetition ending in death. He has stated it out loud. And where SpongeBob, standing in the same kitchen, doing the same job, facing the same endless repetition, somehow says yes to it and glows, Squidward says the truth and is crushed by it. Same kitchen, same repetition, same 40 years, and then you die. One of them is destroyed by the fact and one of them is redeemed by it, and the only difference between them is what happens on the inside, which is, when you strip everything else away, the entire argument of this video standing in one small fast food restaurant. But there is another way to fail Nietzsche's test besides Squidward's despair, and it wears a tiny hat and chases a single coin across the ocean floor, and we have to talk about him next. Eugene Krabs, the owner of the Krusty Krab, is the character who lets us talk about the idea in Nietzsche that gets misused more than any other, the will to power. Because if Squidward is Ressentiment and SpongeBob is Amor Fati, Mr. Krabs is a study in what happens when the will to power, the deepest drive Nietzsche thought was in all living things, gets loose from everything that could make it noble and collapses into a single small appetite. So let me say clearly what the will to power actually is, because the phrase has been dragged into so much ugliness that people hear it and think of tyrants and armies. Nietzsche proposed that the fundamental drive of all life is not, as others had thought, mere survival, not the simple wish to keep existing. He thought that underneath survival there was something more restless, a drive to grow, to expand, to overcome resistance, to discharge strength, to become more than you were. Life, he said, does not just want to persist, it wants to increase. A tree does not merely survive, it reaches. And crucially, this drive can go in wildly different directions depending on the creature. It can be sublimated, turned upward, into art, into knowledge, into the mastery of oneself, into the creation of values, into the overcoming of one's own weaknesses. That is the will to power at its height, and it is basically what the Übermensch is made of, a will to power that has turned inward and become self-overcoming. Or it can stay crude and degrade and shrink down into the raw wish to dominate, to accumulate, to have more than the next creature, simply for the sake of having it. Same drive, radically different fates. Mr. Krabs is the will to power that degraded into pure acquisition, and the show draws it with a savagery that is in fact startling once you stop laughing. This is a creature whose love of money has eaten every other value he might have had. In one episode, he loses parts of his own body chasing a single coin. In another, he fires SpongeBob, his best and most devoted employee, the one who keeps his whole business alive, in order to save the tiniest sliver of money, a few cents. He is willing to endanger customers, betray friends, exploit a workforce of 2, and humiliate himself, all for the accumulation of wealth he does not even spend, because the point was never to use the money. The point is to have it, to pile it up, to watch the number grow. And that is the tell, philosophically, that is the thing that marks him as the degraded case. The will to power at its height wants to grow toward something, toward a work, toward a self, toward a value. Mr. Krabs wants only to grow the pile. His drive to increase has been severed from any purpose beyond increase itself. He hoards. He does not create. He does not overcome himself. He overcomes his own decency, again and again, in the service of a heap of coins. There is a phrase that fits him better than any other, and it connects back to where we started, to the death of God and the vacuum it leaves. Nietzsche worried that when the old highest value, God, the source of all other meaning, collapsed, people would not simply live without a highest value. They would reach around desperately for a replacement, something to put in the empty throne, some new absolute to organize their lives around. And an obvious replacement, the one whole modern civilizations have reached for, is money. Money becomes the new God, the thing that is worshipped, the thing that meaning is measured in, the thing a person will sacrifice everything else to. Mr. Krabs is that substitution, rendered as a crab. He has taken the shape of a life that should point beyond itself, the whole apparatus of striving and building and running an enterprise, and he has aimed all of it at a false idol, a heap of currency that can never love him back, can never fill the hole, can never be enough, because the whole nature of that hunger is that it is bottomless. He built a real thing, a restaurant, a place where the whole town gathers, and he cannot enjoy any of it, because he cannot see past the register. It is worth knowing where that restaurant came from, because the show is actually careful about this, and fans get it tangled. There are several stories in the show about Mr. Krabs and the Krusty Krab, and people sometimes claim they contradict each other, but they do not, quite. Only one of those stories is about the building itself, and in that one, the building the Krusty Krab occupies was originally a bankrupt retirement home, an old folks' home that had gone under, which Mr. Krabs bought and converted. Hold that image for a second, because it is subtly grim and gently perfect. The temple of the last man's small pleasures, the place where the whole town comes to consume its favorite little comfort, is built inside the shell of a place where the old went to wait for death. The other stories, the ones about a pirate ship he once captained, or about how he and Plankton first went into the burger business together as friends, are about Mr. Krabs' own personal and business past, not about where the building came from. And in the pirate one, he actually dresses the restaurant up with props to make it look like a ship, which rather suggests the building is not really that ship at all. I lay that out carefully because I want to be accurate, and because the true origin, a failed retirement home repurposed into a fast food temple, is a far better image for our purposes than any invented contradiction. The building itself carries the creator's own history in its bones, by the way, and I find this deeply lovely. The Krusty Krab is designed to look like a New England lobster trap, and that is not random. As a teenager, Stephen Hillenburg worked at a seafood restaurant up in Maine as a fry cook and a lobster boiler, and the whole idea of SpongeBob's job, the fry cook flipping patties in a nautical greasy spoon, grew directly out of that summer job. So the restaurant where the drama of greed plays out every day is shaped like a trap for lobsters, and modeled on a real place where a young man once boiled them. There is something almost too fitting about running your story of a creature trapped by his own appetites inside a building shaped like a trap. The show, to its credit, does not let Mr. Krabs off the hook, and in one episode it drags him right up to the edge of a reckoning. And this is where I have to be careful, because this is exactly the sort of scene people misremember. In it, Mr. Krabs, in the middle of a scheme to save money by never closing the restaurant, comes face to face with the Flying Dutchman, the show's ghost pirate figure, a kind of undersea Grim Reaper, who has come to take him away, and the destination he is threatened with is Davy Jones's locker. Now, Fans and wikis often describe Davy Jones's locker as the show's version of hell, and you can read it that way. But I want to be precise about what the show actually does, because it is more specific and more interesting than a generic hell. The show never once, in dialogue, calls the place hell. In the running gag, Davy Jones's locker is played completely literally, as an enormous gym locker stuffed full of dirty, reeking old socks, which is a very SpongeBob way to handle damnation. And in this particular episode, the locker is not framed as the fate of the wicked in general. It is framed as the fate reserved specifically for the cheap, for the stingy, for misers. It is the underworld built for people exactly like Mr. Krabs, whose one sin is his greed. So the show is doing something quite pointed. It is not saying Mr. Krabs is going to a general hell for bad people. It is saying there is a special afterlife for the money-obsessed, and he has earned his place in it, and the thing that would damn him is precisely the degraded will to power we have been describing, the hoarding, the coin-chasing, the willingness to sacrifice everything living for a pile that does not live. For one episode, he is made to look directly at what his appetite has done to his soul, and then, because it is that kind of show, the reset arrives and he is fine and greedy again by the next episode, the lesson wiped clean, the pile still there to be worshipped. I want to give you two production details from the darker corners of the Krusty Krab, because they show how much genuine unease the show was willing to build into its brightest setting. The first involves an episode set in the restaurant at night, a spooky one, where SpongeBob and Squidward are stuck working the graveyard shift and telling each other scary stories, and it ends on one of the most famous jump scares in all of children's television, a sudden flash of a hideous, hollow-eyed face, the face of the silent film vampire from the 1920s, Count Orlok, the original screen Nosferatu. That jump scare was a last-minute replacement. The writer had originally planned a different, sillier cause for the flickering lights that build the tension, a character who got cut, and when that fell through, he reached back to a horror image he remembered from a monster magazine he read as a kid, and the crew hunted down reference and built a few seconds of that ancient movie vampire into the corner of a cartoon about a sponge. Years later, one of the people who worked on the show said a viewer told them that flickering, dread-soaked sequence had jump-started her lifelong struggle with a certain anxiety disorder. A few seconds of genuine, adult-grade horror planted in the warmest setting in the show, and it left a real mark on a real person. The Last Man's Paradise has a vampire in the back of the kitchen, if you stay late enough. The second detail is about how the real world kept reaching into the Krusty Krab as well. There is an episode about the rival restaurant across the street trying to poison the town against Krabby Patties, and in it there was originally a scene, running about 40 seconds, of a gasoline and match explosion gag. That scene was cut for reruns in the years after it first aired. One of the show's later showrunners confirmed it was a standards issue, and one of the original writers attributed the removal specifically to the atmosphere in the United States after the attacks of September of 2001. Since the episode had aired only weeks after them, even though the scene had already passed every level of the network's approval before that. The uncut version, apparently, still airs in Canada. I mention it because it is a reminder that even Bikini Bottom, the most sealed-off, self-contained, consequence-free little world imaginable, is not actually sealed off at all. The catastrophes of the world above the water keep seeping down into it, keep reaching in and discreetly editing it. The way the bombs are up there over the atoll whether the fish look up or not. But greed that faces its reckoning and forgets it is only one failure mode. There is a creature across the street from Mr. Krabs who represents the opposite extreme, a will to power that never degrades into comfort and never rests for a single second, and he loses every single time, and he might be the most Nietzschean figure in the whole ocean. Sheldon Plankton runs the Chum Bucket, the failing restaurant directly across the street from the Krusty Krab, and he has one goal, which he has pursued for the entire run of the show with a persistence that crosses over from comedy into something almost heroic if you squint at it the right way. He wants the secret formula for the Krabby Patty. He wants to steal it, so that he can finally make a burger the town will eat, so that he can defeat Mr. Krabs, his rival, and, in a bit of backstory the show does eventually fill in, his one-time childhood friend, the two of them having started out as a pair of outcasts before their paths split into success and failure. And Plankton fails. He fails and fails and fails. His schemes are elaborate, ingenious, tireless, and they collapse, over and over, episode after episode, year after year, decade after decade, and every time they collapse, he picks himself up and begins another one. Now, before I read him, let me clear away a couple of the myths that cluster around this character, because they are exactly the sort of thing that gets a video corrected. People often say Plankton is the smallest creature in the show, and he is indeed tiny, a microscopic little organism, a copepod, one of the smallest characters, but he is not the very smallest, because his own pet, an amoeba named Spot, is smaller still. And people often say that only Mr. Krabs knows the secret formula, or that it is hidden under his mattress. The truth is a little looser. The formula is normally kept locked in a safe or a vault inside the Krusty Krab, written on paper sealed in a small bottle, and SpongeBob himself knows the combination to that safe. So Mr. Krabs is not the sole keeper of the secret at all. The mattress business shows up only in a couple of specific episodes, and is not the general rule. The hiding place drifts around depending on the story. And there is one more fact that matters most for reading Plankton. The one people forget because it undercuts the running joke. Plankton does not actually fail every single time. In the first theatrical film, back in 2004, he succeeded. He got the formula, he used it, and for a stretch of that movie, his plan actually worked. So the record is not perfect. It is nearly perfect. A lifetime of defeat, with one enormous exception, which is somehow even more poignant than an unbroken losing streak, because it means he knows, he has tasted, that victory is possible, and still it slips away from him again and again, and he never, ever stops trying. That refusal to stop is the whole thing, and it makes Plankton the exact opposite of the last man, which is why I find him so fascinating in this context. Remember what the last man is. He wants comfort, safety, an end to striving, the little pleasure and the painless day. He has, above all, given up the great longing. He no longer reaches for anything difficult because reaching is uncomfortable and might fail. Now look at Plankton. Plankton is nothing but great longing. He is will to power in its rawest, most undiluted, most tireless form. A creature who wants something enormous and difficult and keeps hurling his entire being at it in the face of total, humiliating, unrelenting defeat. He does not settle. He does not accept his lot. He does not move to the comfortable suburb and take up a hobby. He does not, like Mr. Krabs, sit on a pile and worship it. He strives and strives and strives, and the striving never once collapses into the contentment Nietzsche feared. And there is a real question buried in that. A question the show poses without ever answering, which is whether Plankton's doomed, tireless, always defeated striving might actually be nobler than the comfortable happiness of everyone around him. Nietzsche, I think, might really say yes. He valued the reaching over the arriving. He thought a person who strives greatly and fails is worth more than a person who never strives at all and calls the not striving happiness. By that measure, this microscopic villain, this joke of a creature who cannot even win over his own sentient computer wife half the time, might be closer to what Nietzsche admired than any of the cheerful citizens who defeat him. But I do not want to romanticize him too far, because Plankton is also drenched in the very thing we diagnosed in Squidward, and the mixture is what makes him tragic rather than triumphant. He is soaked in ressentiment. His striving is not really the clean, self-overcoming will to power of the Übermensch, aimed at creating something of his own. It is aimed, obsessively, enviously, at Mr. Krabs, at taking what Krabs has, at defeating the creature who got the success that Plankton believes should have been his. His will to power is bent, curved back on itself by resentment of a rival, and that is why it stays sterile. He could, in principle, spend all that ferocious energy and intelligence building something truly his own. Instead, he spends all of it trying to steal a recipe, to beat one specific crab, to overturn one specific verdict of the world that ranked him below his old friend. His longing is huge and real and, in its way, admirable, and it is also poisoned at the root by the fact that it is defined entirely by another creature's success. He is the striver who never rests, and also the striver who never creates, because everything he does is reactive, a response to Krabs rather than an expression of Plankton. That is the tragedy the show keeps mining for laughs. He has the engine of an Übermensch and the orientation of a man eaten alive by envy, and the two cancel out into an eternity of brilliant, tireless, doomed schemes. And the eternity really is the point. This is where Plankton connects to the deep structure we keep circling, the endless repetition of the show, which we will finally take head-on soon. Because Plankton, more than any other character, is trapped in a loop and refuses to acknowledge it. Every episode he schemes, every episode he loses, every episode the reset restores him to his failing restaurant and his empty dining room and his sneering resolve, and he begins again. If the eternal return, the idea that you must live the same life over and over forever, is a test, then Plankton is taking that test constantly and, in his own strange way, passing it. Because he affirms his doomed struggle, he wills it again every single time. He never once says this is pointless and lies down. He goes to college, he reminds everyone, repeatedly, that he went to college, he is smart, he tried, and he will try again tomorrow, and lose again tomorrow, and try again the day after. There is something in that which is almost magnificent, and something in it which is almost unbearably sad, and the show holds both at once, which is why he lands so much harder than a simple villain. I want to give you a real-world detail about Plankton's corner of the franchise that fits the theme of grand plans meeting flat defeat. Because it is true, and a little melancholy, there is an episode of the show that was built around a virus storyline, a plot involving a sickness spreading, and it was finished and scheduled to air. And then the real world produced a pandemic of its own, and the network decided it would be insensitive to broadcast a comic virus story in the middle of a genuine global health crisis, so they shelved the episode entirely. It sat on the shelf for 2 full years before it was finally allowed to air, held back not because there was anything wrong with it, but because reality had, once again, reached down into Bikini Bottom and overruled it. And there is a broader version of the same melancholy in the franchise's films. The third theatrical movie, the most recent one, had the terrible luck to be finished right as the world shut down, and instead of the grand wide release its predecessors got, it ended up playing in only a few hundred theaters worldwide, a tiny scattered handful, and grossing almost nothing at the box office by the standards of the series, while the second film had been the franchise's biggest hit. Grand ambition, meticulous work, and then the world intervenes, and the thing barely reaches anyone. It is a very Plankton kind of fate, the elaborate scheme undone at the last moment by forces entirely outside your control. And I think of him when I think of that quiet, unlucky little film playing to nearly empty rooms. So we have 3 failures of the Nietzschean test now, 3 ways to get it wrong. Squidward, who sees the emptiness and curdles into bitter ressentiment. Mr. Krabs, whose will to power rotted into the worship of a coin. And Plankton, whose will to power stays fierce and tireless and alive, but is bent by envy into an eternal, sterile, doomed loop. Each of them, in his own way, is a portrait of what happens when a creature confronts the meaninglessness of the endless repeating world and responds badly, with bitterness, with greed, with obsession. But there are creatures in Bikini Bottom who are not tormented at all, who float through the same empty repeating world in a state of perfect, untroubled peace. And I have been putting off the hardest question of the whole video, which is whether that peace is the deepest wisdom in the ocean or the most complete surrender to everything Nietzsche was afraid of. To ask it properly, we have to talk about a pink starfish lying on the seafloor, doing absolutely nothing and loving it. Patrick Star is SpongeBob's best friend, and he is, on the surface, the simplest character in the entire show. He is dim, he is lazy, he is unemployed, and not in a way that troubles him in the slightest. He lives under a rock, literally under a rock, and his idea of a full and satisfying day is to eat something and then go back to sleep. He calls himself, when he calls himself anything, an expert in the art of doing nothing, and he means it as a genuine boast. He is emotionally steady, almost impossible to ruffle at his core, agreeable, loyal, and profoundly, serenely, unbothered by the questions that torment Squidward and drive Plankton, and never once occur to Mr. Krabs. If SpongeBob is the knife edge of the whole video, the character we cannot resolve, Patrick is something simpler and, in his way, just as important. He is the purest embodiment of the state Nietzsche most feared, and also, read another way, of a kind of blessedness that came before all fear. And which of those he is depends entirely on a distinction we have not fully drawn yet. Let me start with the frightening reading, because it is the obvious one. If SpongeBob's contentment, is at least ambiguous, at least arguably an earned yes to life. Patrick's contentment has no such defense available. Patrick is content because Patrick has never once asked the question. He is not a creature who has faced the abyss and chosen to love his life anyway. He is a creature for whom the abyss does not exist, because introspection does not exist, because the machinery that would generate the question was never installed. He wants his little pleasure for the day and his little pleasure for the night, food and sleep and the company of his friend, and he wants nothing beyond that, not because he has weighed the alternatives and rejected them, but because the alternatives have never crossed his mind. He is the last man stripped down to the absolute minimum, the last man with even the blinking removed, torpor so complete that it does not even know itself as torpor. Nietzsche's last man at least had to invent his happiness, had to actively organize a life around the avoidance of greatness. Patrick did not have to invent anything. He simply lies under his rock and is happy, and the happiness costs him nothing because there was never anything in him that might have wanted more. And the crowd, the herd, the whole town of Bikini Bottom is essentially a town of Patricks with jobs. This is the sociological heart of the last man that we touched on with Squidville but need to state fully now. Nietzsche did not think the last man would appear one at a time, as an individual quirk. He thought the last man was the destiny of a whole society, a mass condition, a herd, and the defining feature of the herd is not just that it is comfortable, it is that it enforces its comfort, that it distrusts and flattens anything that rises above the average, because the exceptional individual, the one who strives, the one who wants something higher, is a kind of reproach to the herd's contentment and a kind of danger to it. The herd wants everyone to be the same, wants no one to make the others feel that their small life is small, and Bikini Bottom runs on exactly this instinct, reinforced by the deepest law of the show, the reset, which we keep circling and will finally land on. Because negative continuity is not just a storytelling device. Read philosophically, it is the herd's ultimate weapon. Every time a character rises above the baseline, every time Squidward achieves greatness, or SpongeBob learns something, or the world honestly changes, the reset drags it back down to the average by the next episode. The town cannot permit anything exceptional to last. It is a machine for producing sameness, for guaranteeing that no leap forward ever sticks, that everyone ends every week exactly as small as they began it. The herd made into the very physics of the universe. I promised earlier I would come back to the crowd that cheered, and this is the place. When Nietzsche's prophet described the last man to the marketplace, the crowd did not recoil, they begged to become him. That is the herd affirming itself, the mass recognizing its own deepest wish in the picture of comfortable smallness and crying out, yes, that, give us that. And you can watch Bikini Bottom do this constantly, most vividly in its consumer frenzies, the episodes where the whole town loses its mind over a product, stampeding for chocolate, mobbing a store, whipped into collective ecstasy not over anything great, but over a small thing to buy and consume. That is the herd cheering for its own smallness, the marketplace crowd rendered as a mob of fish trampling each other for a sweet. There is a wonderful, telling detail buried in these crowd scenes, by the way, one of those things only the devoted fans track. In nearly every scene of mass chaos in the show, the same background fish gets injured, a character who cries out that his leg is hurt, over and over, across hundreds of episodes, a running gag so persistent that the fish is actually a named recurring character, first appearing way back in the first season, and eventually given his very own episode, built around the joke. And the background crowds he suffers in are themselves formally catalogued by the crew under a numbering system, a whole stock cast of numbered incidental fish reused across the entire run, the same anonymous townsfolk, shuffled and reshuffled through scene after scene. Think about what that means as an image. The herd of Bikini Bottom is literally a set of interchangeable, numbered, reusable extras, the same faces cycled endlessly through the same crowds, one of them perpetually getting hurt in the crush and crying out and being forgotten. That is the herd rendered with an almost brutal literalness, not individuals, inventory. But I do not want to leave Patrick there, as merely the nadir of the herd, because there is a second reading of him that is much warmer and much stranger, and it comes from a beautiful passage Nietzsche wrote. Early in Zarathustra, the prophet describes what he calls the three metamorphoses of the spirit. The three stages a soul can pass through on its way to freedom. First, the spirit becomes a camel, the beast of burden, who kneels down and says, "Load me up," who bears the heavy weights of duty and reverence and tradition, all the thou shalts handed down from above, and carries them out into the desert. Then, alone in the desert, the camel becomes a lion, and the lion's whole task is to fight a great dragon, and every scale of the dragon glitters with a thou shalt, and the lion roars against it a sacred no, and wins for itself the freedom to say "I will," the freedom from all the old commands. But the lion cannot create new values. It can only destroy the old ones. It can win freedom, but it does not yet know what to do with freedom. And so the spirit must undergo one last transformation, the strangest and highest of the three. The lion must become a child. Because the child, Nietzsche says, is innocence and forgetting, a new beginning, a self-propelled wheel, a first movement, a sacred yes. Only the child, having forgotten the old burdens and destroyed the old commands, can create new values out of pure innocent affirmation, can begin the world again as if fresh. The child is the goal. The child is the one who says the great yes to life, not from exhaustion but from overflowing. Now here is the trap, and it is the exact trap Patrick sits inside. The child of the three metamorphoses looks, from the outside, almost identical to pure animal innocence. Both are carefree. Both are unburdened. Both say yes to life without agonizing. But there is a world of difference between them, and the difference is the whole road. The child of Zarathustra earned its innocence. It was first a camel, it bore the weights, it went into the desert, it became a lion. It fought the dragon and said no to everything false, and only then, on the far side of all that struggle, did it come out into a second innocence, a knowing innocence. A yes, said by someone who has been through the whole ordeal, and come out the other side lighter. Patrick's innocence is the first kind, the innocence that comes before the journey rather than after it. He is carefree because he never picked up the burden, never went into the desert, never fought anything. His yes to life is real, and it is lovely, and it cost nothing, because he skipped every stage that would have given it weight. He is the child without ever having been the camel or the lion, which means he is not really the child at all. He is the animal, the pre-moral, pre-conscious creature who is at peace only because he never woke up. And Nietzsche would tell you, gently I think, that this is a kind of blessedness, but it is not the blessedness a human being should aim for, because it is a blessedness available only to those who never became fully awake in the first place. You cannot get back to the garden by refusing to leave it, which is what makes Patrick such a perfect companion for SpongeBob, and such a perfect contrast. And here is where I will let myself have an actual opinion, because I have been building to it. I think the show, whether it knows it or not, places SpongeBob and Patrick right next to each other, precisely so that we can feel the difference between two kinds of happiness that look identical from a distance. Patrick is happy because nothing has ever reached him. SpongeBob is happy in spite of everything reaching him constantly. Put them side by side, both grinning, both content, both loving their small repeating lives, and the whole moral weight of the show is in the gap between why. That gap is invisible on the surface. Both of them are just laughing on the seafloor. But it is the difference between the animal who never left the garden and the strange creature who walked through every hardship the world could throw at him and came out the other side still able to laugh. One of them is Nietzsche's warning. The other might be his hope. And they are best friends, and they blow bubbles together, and neither of them will ever know that they are the two poles of the whole argument. I owe you the fact I have been saving about Patrick, because it is one of the best in the whole subject, and it recolors everything I just said. Patrick, this serene, blissful, unbothered creature, this Dionysian heart of the show, was not conceived that way at all. In the earliest development of the character, Patrick was written as an antagonist. One of the show's creative directors has said, in an oral history of the series, that the original Patrick was angry, with, in his words, a huge chip on his shoulder because he was pink. Consider that, the character who became the very picture of untroubled contentment, the creature I have just spent all this time describing as the being who never woke up to suffering, began his life on the drawing board as a bitter, resentful, chip-on-the-shoulder grump, wounded by his own color, closer in spirit to Squidward than to the Patrick we know. Somewhere in development they turned him inside out. took all the resentment out and left only the innocence. And in doing so, they accidentally created the perfect philosophical foil, the counterweight to Squidward on one side and the shadow of SpongeBob on the other. The blissful Patrick exists only because someone decided to delete the bitter one. And I find that actually striking, because it means the show's picture of pure contentment was a choice, a subtraction, a version of the character with the ressentiment surgically removed. They built the ultimate last man by taking a Squidward and erasing his wound. There is one more thing about Patrick's world I want to give you, because it is famous, and it is funnier and stranger than people realize, and it says something about how this whole gentle universe handles the things it is not allowed to say. There is an episode built entirely around SpongeBob and Patrick learning a bad word, a swear word, which they hear and then repeat gleefully all over town without understanding it. And every time either of them says it, the show replaces the word with a comic honking dolphin-like noise. Almost everyone who has seen it assumes that sound is a dolphin. It is not. It is a sped-up recording of a laughing kookaburra, a bird, a call originally lifted from an old 1960s film about a dolphin, and still sold in a professional sound effects library to this day. And the reason the show used a silly bird noise at all is the most telling part. The creator wanted, originally, to have the characters actually use bad language, or at least to bleep it, and the network said no, absolutely not, you cannot even use a bleep. So, denied the swear, and denied the bleep, he reached for an absurd animal honk instead, and that honk became one of the most famous censor dodges in television history. There was, in the original scripts, an even ruder version of the gag that got cut entirely before anyone could object. And I love this as a final image for the herd, because it is the herd's relationship to danger in a nutshell. Not the thing itself, not even the honest acknowledgement that the thing has been hidden, but a cheerful, ridiculous bird noise pasted over the hole where the dangerous thing used to be, so that everyone can laugh, and no one has to feel anything sharp. It is the same instinct that repainted the rainbow yellow. Cover the edge. Honk over the wound. Keep it soft. But not everyone in Bikini Bottom is soft, and there is one resident who refuses the whole arrangement, who trains and builds and strives and keeps climbing when everyone around her has lain down, and she is the closest thing this ocean has to the figure Nietzsche actually hoped for. Sandy Cheeks is a squirrel from Texas who lives at the bottom of the sea. That sentence alone tells you almost everything about her relationship to Bikini Bottom, because she does not belong there, and she knows it, and she has bent the entire situation to her will, rather than letting it bend her. She cannot breathe underwater, so she built herself a home, a glass dome full of air with a tree inside it, an entire pocket of the surface world transplanted to the ocean floor, and when she leaves it she wears a diving suit and a helmet full of air. She is a scientist, an inventor, a martial artist, an athlete, an extreme sports enthusiast, and she carries all of it with a fierce, competitive, self-assured pride. Proud of her intelligence, proud of her strength, proud of where she comes from. And in a town of last men, in a herd of contented small creatures who have lain down, Sandy is the one resident who is still, every single day, climbing. Read her through Nietzsche, and she snaps into a very specific place, the place none of the others occupy. If Squidward is ressentiment, and Krabs is degraded will to power, and Plankton is will to power poisoned by envy, and Patrick is the herd at rest, Sandy is will to power in its healthiest form, the will turned upward into knowledge, mastery, and self-overcoming. She is the closest thing Bikini Bottom has to what Nietzsche was actually reaching for when he talked about the higher human being. Because notice what she does with her drive. She does not aim it at hoarding, like Krabs, or at defeating a rival, like Plankton, or at flattering herself about her taste while producing nothing, like Squidward. She aims it at overcoming, at genuine mastery, at becoming more than she was. She trains her body. She trains her mind. She builds machines, runs experiments, tests herself against the elements, pushes into the extreme, and she does it not to defeat anyone, but because the growth itself is the reward. That is the will to power, sublimated exactly as Nietzsche described its highest form, the drive to increase turned into science, into discipline, into self-mastery, into the ongoing project of self-overcoming that never lets a creature settle into the comfortable smallness of the last man. She is also, in the terms we set up back with Squidward, a pure and successful Apollonian, and it is worth seeing her as the resolution of the tension Squidward could never resolve. Recall that the Apollonian is the principle of order, form, reason, clarity, the imposing of shape on chaos. Squidward craved Apollonian form and could never fill it with life. Sandy is Apollonian order that actually works, because she is not craving form for the sake of status. She is using reason and structure to understand and reshape the world around her. She is a rational, ordering, scientific mind imposing clean form on the chaotic sea, and unlike Squidward, she produces. Her experiments run. Her inventions function. Her karate is real. The order she loves is a living order, a working order, not a defensive shell she hides inside. And there is a lovely fittingness in the fact that the man who created the whole show was himself a scientist first, a marine biologist, before he was ever an animator. Sandy, the squirrel scientist studying the sea, is in a sense the creator's own self, dropped into his own creation. The one character who looks at Bikini Bottom the way a biologist looks at a tide pool, with curiosity and rigor and a hunger to understand, rather than merely to enjoy. She is the Apollonian intelligence of the show's own origin, wearing a helmet full of air. And here I have to be honest about the limit of the reading, because Sandy is the closest thing the town has to an Ubermensch, and she is still not quite one. And the reason why is one of the saddest quiet facts about Bikini Bottom. The Ubermensch, in Nietzsche's vision, is not merely a self-overcomer. He is a creator of values, someone whose way of living becomes a new possibility that others can be transformed by, a bridge that others might cross. And the tragedy of Sandy is that nobody follows her. She climbs and climbs, alone, and the herd does not climb with her, does not even really notice she is climbing. She is admired, occasionally, as a curiosity, the smart one, the strong one, the one who does the strange surface world things. But nobody in Bikini Bottom looks at Sandy and thinks, I should become more than I am. I should train. I should learn. I should overcome myself the way she does. She is the lone self-overcomer in a town constitutionally incapable of self-overcoming, and the reset guarantees she will stay lone, because nothing she models can ever take root and spread, because the machinery of the show drags everything back to baseline before it can grow. She is an Ubermensch with no disciples in a universe engineered to prevent discipleship. She keeps climbing and the mountain keeps resetting to sea level underneath her. I keep coming back to the tree dome, her glass bubble of air, because it is such a precise image of her whole situation, and it works on more than one level. On the surface, it is a practical solution. A squirrel needs air, so she makes air. But look at it philosophically, and it is the image of the higher individual who has to build her own world, because the world she lives in cannot sustain her. And she cannot breathe the atmosphere of Bikini Bottom, cannot live on the contented, oxygen-poor air of the last man's town. So she constructs a sealed pocket of a different, richer air and lives inside it. And she has to put on armor every time she steps out into the general element. That is, whether the show means it or not, a near-perfect picture of what it is like to be the one striving creature in a society of the comfortable. You cannot breathe what they breathe. You have to build your own atmosphere and carry a piece of it with you when you go among them. And they can visit your bubble, but they always have to bring their own water helmet, because they cannot survive for long in the thinner, higher, more demanding air you have made for yourself. Let me give you the strange, delightful details from Sandy's corner of the show, because they connect to the theme of a scientist's ordered mind hiding inside a cartoon, which is really what she is. There is an episode where Sandy takes SpongeBob and Patrick up in a rocket, and buried inside it is a shot-for-shot recreation of a scene from Ridley Scott's horror film Alien, the two of them inspecting a sleeping Squidward, the way the crew of the doomed spaceship inspects the alien egg, right down to a tentacle latching onto a helmet, the way the creature latches onto a face in the film. A children's cartoon about a squirrel's rocket containing a frame-by-frame homage to one of the scariest science fiction films ever made. And it fits Sandy, somehow, that the darkest, most rigorous cinematic reference in the show lives in her episode, the science one, the one about going up and out into the unknown. The show that surrounds her is built, at its foundation, on real biology, real animals observed with a naturalist's eye. Gary, SpongeBob's pet snail, is a scientifically deliberate joke, a slow, silent sea snail, given the voice of a house cat, with eye stalks and a shell that mirror the real sea snails a biologist would know. The sound of the whole world was built with the same craftsman's care. designed deliberately after the style of a certain school of French animation. The effects made vocally or by primitive means rather than pulled from the standard libraries, so that the entire soundscape has a handmade, slightly homemade quality that matches the hand-painted look. There is, underneath all the chaos, an enormous amount of deliberate, ordered, careful craft, and Sandy is the character who most embodies that hidden order, the one who makes the show's secret rigor visible. So is Sandy the answer then? Is she the one who gets it right, the model we are supposed to follow out of The Last Man's Town? I do not think the show lets her be quite that, and I think the reason is important and a little melancholy. Sandy is admirable. She is the healthiest drive in the ocean. She is the one who keeps climbing, and yet the show never treats her striving as the emotional center, never asks us to love her the way we love the sponge who does nothing but flip patties. And I think, if I am honest about my own reading, that is because pure self-overcoming, pure mastery, the will to climb and know and conquer, is admirable, but it is not by itself the whole of what Nietzsche was after. He did not just want strength and mastery, he wanted the yes. He wanted amor fati, the love of one's fate, the capacity to say yes to this life exactly as it is, suffering included, and to will it again. And Sandy, for all her strength, is always striving toward a different state, always climbing toward something she has not reached yet, always improving, which is magnificent, but which is not the same as loving where you already are. There is a hunger in her that never rests, and a hunger that never rests can look, from a certain angle, a little like a refusal to say yes to the present, a permanent postponement of the affirmation to some higher rung not yet climbed, which means the deepest question of the whole show is not actually answered by the strongest character. It circles back, again, to the yellow one, the one who is not climbing anywhere, who has no mountain, who flips the same patty forever and somehow, impossibly, says yes to it. And to understand him, and to understand the whole strange machine he lives inside, we finally have to talk directly about the thing I have been putting off since the very beginning, the deepest and strangest idea Nietzsche ever had, and the one this entire show is secretly built around. The idea is called the eternal recurrence, or the eternal return, and Nietzsche introduces it in one of the most haunting passages he ever wrote, near the end of a book called The Gay Science. He does not present it as a fact or a theory. He presents it as a question, a test, and I want to read you the shape of it, because nothing I could say around it lands as hard as the thing itself. Imagine, he says, that one night, in your loneliest loneliness, a demon were to slip into your room and say to you, "This life as you now live it and have lived it, you will have to live once more, and innumerable times more, and there will be nothing new in it, but every pain, and every joy, and every thought, and every sigh, everything unspeakably small or great in your life, must return to you, all in the same succession and sequence, the same spider, the same moonlight between the trees, the same demon, the same moment, and you yourself with it, the whole thing over and over, forever, an eternal hourglass of existence turned upside down again and again, and you with it, a speck of dust." And then Nietzsche asks the only question that matters. Would you throw yourself down and gnash your teeth and curse the demon who spoke this? Or would there be a moment in which you could answer him, "You are a god, and never have I heard anything more divine"? That is the eternal recurrence. It is not a claim that time literally repeats, though Nietzsche toyed with a version of that in his private notebooks. As he uses it in the book, it is a test of how you feel about your life, the most demanding test he could devise. Because to say yes to the demon, to want your life again exactly as it was, every humiliation and every loss and every dull Tuesday included, not a single thing changed, you would have to love your life so completely, so without reservation, that the prospect of living it forever fills you with joy rather than horror. Anyone can wish for a better life. The eternal recurrence asks whether you can love this one, the real one, the one you actually have, so much that you would take it again and again into infinity. It is amor fati turned into a thought experiment, the love of fate made into a specific and terrible question. And almost nobody, Nietzsche knew, could answer yes. Almost everyone, faced with the demon, would gnash their teeth, because almost everyone is waiting for their life to finally start, waiting for the better version, and could not bear the thought that this exact thing is all there will ever be, forever. Now think about the show. Think about what SpongeBob SquarePants actually is, structurally, as an object. It is a machine for producing the eternal recurrence. We have circled this again and again, and now we can name it fully. The show runs on negative continuity. Nothing accumulates. Nothing is permanently gained, and nothing is permanently lost. Every episode, the world resets to exactly the same baseline. The characters do not age, they do not learn, they do not progress. Squidward achieves greatness, and it is erased. The town is destroyed, and it comes back. Someone dies, and they are alive again. And then the same day begins, the same Krusty Krab opens, the same patties are flipped, the same schemes are launched and defeated, the same test is failed, the same joys and the same humiliations return in the same succession, forever, world without end. Bikini Bottom is not a place where the eternal recurrence is a philosophical thought experiment. It is a place where the eternal recurrence is the literal physics of the universe. The demon has already visited. The demon lives there. Every single character in that town is living the exact life Nietzsche's demon described, the same life over and over, innumerable times, nothing new, everything returning. And the whole moral drama of the show, though it never says so, is simply the different ways each character answers the demon's question. Squidward gnashes his teeth, faced with the eternal return of his life, the same order the food and cook the food in 40 years and then you die. He curses it, and the cursing is his whole character. He is the one who feels the horror of the recurrence most fully, who understands that nothing will ever change, that tomorrow is today is yesterday, and it destroys him. Mr. Krabs does not even notice the recurrence, because he is too busy counting, distracting himself from the emptiness of the loop with the accumulation of coins that can never fill it. Plankton answers the demon with a kind of defiance, willing his doomed struggle again and again, taking the eternal return of his own defeat and refusing to stop, which is closer to a yes than anyone else's answer but a yes poisoned by the envy that drives it. Patrick does not hear the demon at all, sleeps through the visit, is at peace with the loop only because he is not awake enough to know he is in one, and Sandy tries to climb out of the loop entirely, tries to overcome and progress and go somewhere new, which is the noblest response of all, except that the machinery of the world will not permit it, so she is condemned to have her every ascent reset beneath her. And then there is SpongeBob, who answers the demon with the one response Nietzsche thought almost no one could give: yes, again. He wakes up every morning into the same life, the same job, the same repetition that crushes Squidward, and he throws his arms into the air and shouts that he is ready, and he means it, and he is happy. He is the only creature in the entire ocean who is living the eternal recurrence and loving it, who takes the same Tuesday again and again into infinity and greets each return with genuine joy. If the eternal recurrence is the test, then SpongeBob, alone in all of Bikini Bottom, is passing it. He is the one who can look at the demon and say, "You are a god," and never have I heard anything more divine, except he does not even need the demon to ask, because he is already living the answer every single day. That is either the most profound thing in the whole show, or a cosmic accident of a children's cartoon, and I cannot decide which, and I think that undecidability is the most interesting thing about the entire series. The single clearest image of the recurrence, the one I have been saving, is the boating test. SpongeBob is, and has been for the entire run of the show, a student at Mrs. Puff's boating school, and he has never passed. He takes the driving test, and he fails. He takes it again, and he fails again. Episode after episode, year after year, decade after decade, he takes the same test and fails it in some new catastrophic way. And Mrs. Puff, his long-suffering teacher, a pufferfish who inflates with terror every time he gets behind the wheel, endures it again and again, and neither of them ever escapes the cycle. It is a perfect, self-contained image of the eternal return of the same, an exam repeated forever and never passed, a task that can never be completed and never be abandoned. And what truly gets me about it is the thing that turns it from a joke into something almost beautiful. SpongeBob never stops trying, and he never stops enjoying his life in between the attempts, and the perpetual failure does not sour him. Squidward's 40 years and then you die is the same structure, the endless repetition, and it destroys him. SpongeBob's endless failed boating test is the same structure, and he takes it in stride, comes back next time as eager as ever, loves his life anyway. The recurrence is identical. The response is everything. I want to give you the production facts that make this even richer, because the show's own making mirrors its metaphysics in ways I find delightful. Consider first that the show does not even air in order. Nickelodeon has long broadcast episodes in what fans call packaging order, an arrangement that ignores both the order the episodes were produced in and the order they were originally meant to air in, so that an episode made during one season might not surface for years, out of sequence, unmoored from time. One famous case involves an episode produced during the second season that did not actually air until years later. The result is that for the viewer, Bikini Bottom exists outside of chronology entirely, its episodes shuffled and reshuffled and repeated on television, in loops that have nothing to do with when they were made, the same installments returning again and again in ever-changing arrangements, so that the show, as most people actually experience it, flipping past it on a channel at random, is a truly timeless, orderless, eternally recurring stream, with no beginning and no end. You do not watch SpongeBob from the start to the finish. You drop into the loop wherever it happens to be, the way you might be dropping into it right now, and it does not matter, because there is no start and no finish, only the eternal return of the same bright town. And within that timeless stream, the crew planted tiny threads that reach across the years, small objects that recur, and I love these because they are the show gently insisting that something can carry over, even in a world built to forget. The teddy bear that SpongeBob sleeps with in later episodes is, if you track it, the very first prize he ever won from a claw machine in an episode years earlier. A piece of graffiti reading that Squidward smells, scrawled in one early episode, reappears years later on a mall door in a completely different episode. These are cross-season callbacks, deliberate little continuities smuggled into a show whose whole law is that nothing continues, objects that return, half hidden, across the recurrence, like small proofs that memory is possible even here. There is something almost tender about that. The animators leaving little breadcrumbs of persistence in a universe designed to erase everything, as if to say that even in the eternal return, even in the town that forgets, a teddy bear can come back, a joke can come back, something small and loved can survive the reset if someone cares enough to carry it forward. I should be careful and honest about one thing here, because it is exactly the sort of place a video like this drifts into invention. There is no single canonical time loop episode where the show declares its own eternal recurrence, no moment where a character turns to the camera and explains the metaphysics. The recurrence is not stated. It is structural, it is the reset, it is negative continuity, and reading it as the eternal return is my interpretation. An interpretation a fair number of people have arrived at, but an interpretation and not a line of dialogue. The closest the show comes to a literal device that erases a being from existence is a magic pencil in one episode, a pencil that can draw things into life, and then, with its eraser, rub them back out of existence entirely, which is a real and specific and rather eerie thing the show actually does, a creation that gets erased. But that is a single episode's gadget, not a cosmic law, and I am not going to pretend the show has some grand, explicit statement of eternal recurrence that it does not have. What it has is something subtler and, I think, better. It has a world that simply behaves like the eternal return, without ever announcing it, so that the philosophy is not in the dialogue, but in the bones. And a town that behaves like the eternal return, populated by creatures who each answer its demand differently, is a far more honest illustration of Nietzsche's idea than any speech could be. Which finally brings us to the question of, what holds a world like that together? What a town of the eternal recurrence worships, and what happens to its gods? Because every civilization has its gods, its higher powers, the figures it looks up to as sources of meaning and protection and greatness. And Bikini Bottom is no exception. Its gods are two superheroes, named Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy, a pair of aquatic crime fighters the whole town reveres, whom SpongeBob and Patrick worship with the total, uncritical devotion of children before an altar. These are the town's legends, its protectors, its heroes, the beings who stand above ordinary fish life as something grander and more powerful. And the deep joke the show tells about them, the joke that turns out to be among the most Nietzschean things in the entire series. Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy are extremely old, They are retired, feeble, senile old men, living out their days in a rest home. One of them barely able to remember his own catchphrase. The other, a bitter geriatric sidekick still resentful, after all these decades, of being called boy. The gods of Bikini Bottom are two doddering pensioners who can barely get out of their chairs. The higher powers the town looks up to are in fact exhausted, diminished, half-forgotten old men whose greatness, if it ever existed, is long behind them. Read that through the idea we started with, the death of God, and it becomes almost startlingly apt. Nietzsche's madman did not say that God had never existed. He said that God was dead, that the belief that had once organized all of Western meaning had died, had grown old and feeble, and finally expired, and that we were all still living in the enormous shadow of a corpse, still going to the temples out of habit, still repeating the catchphrases, while the thing itself had simply ceased to be alive. The town's continued worship of two senile superheroes who can no longer do anything heroic is that exact situation rendered as comedy. The gods are still there, the town still reveres them, the devotion is still real, especially in SpongeBob, who believes in his heroes with a pure and total faith. But the gods themselves are spent, powerless, kept on as figures of nostalgia and habit, worshipped for a greatness that has drained out of them. The believers have not noticed that their gods have grown too old to save anyone. They keep the faith going out of love and momentum, in the shadow of powers that are no longer powerful. That is, whether the writers intended it or not, a remarkably precise picture of what Nietzsche meant by living after the death of God, a whole community organized around a reverence for something that has subtly lost its life, while everyone keeps bowing anyway. And there is a beautiful, sad real-world layer underneath those two characters that makes the whole thing land even harder. Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy were voiced by two genuine legends of an older era of American entertainment, Ernest Borgnine and Tim Conway, two actors who had starred together in a military sitcom back in the 1960s, playing off each other decades before SpongeBob existed. Casting them as the aging superheroes was itself a kind of in-joke, a reunion of two old stars from a bygone age, playing two old heroes from a bygone age. Their real faded stardom folded into the character's faded heroism. And then, in the natural course of things, Ernest Borgnine died, in 2012, in his 90s, and the character of Mermaid Man, so tied to his particular gravelly voice, could not simply be recast as if nothing had happened. The god had a mortal body, and the mortal body died, the way all the old gods eventually do. There is something deeply poignant in that, the town's immortal hero brought up short by the plain human mortality of the man who gave him his voice, the myth outliving the man only barely and never quite the same again. The old gods grow feeble, and then the voices that animated them fall silent, and the shadow of the dead gods stretches on. I bring up the way real death reaches into these towering figures because it connects to something I owe you about Nietzsche himself, a piece of his story that is exactly this shape, the distortion of a legacy after its bearer can no longer speak. Because Nietzsche, the man who wrote so unforgettably about the death of God and the danger of nihilism, suffered one of the ugliest posthumous fates of any thinker in history, and it is important, if we are going to spend 3 hours with his ideas, to be honest about it. After his mental collapse, when he could no longer write or object or defend a single word, the guardianship of his work and his archive fell to his sister, Elizabeth. And Elizabeth was a nationalist and an anti-Semite, everything her brother had explicitly, repeatedly, furiously opposed. Nietzsche had broken with people he loved over exactly these poisons, had written with contempt against the nationalism and the anti-Semitism of his time. And his sister, after his death, edited his notebooks, assembled fragments he had never published, into a book she titled The Will to Power, and presented as his crowning work, and steered the whole legacy toward the very ideologies he had despised, until eventually, the Nazis were able to claim him as a kind of prophet, which he emphatically was not. This is one of the great facts everyone should know before they say the word Nietzsche. The snarling, Superman-worshipping proto-fascist of popular imagination is very largely a forgery, assembled by a bitter sister over the silent body of a man who could no longer say no. The real Nietzsche was anti-nationalist, anti-Semitic, a sick and gentle and lonely writer whose ideas were dressed up in someone else's hatreds after he was too broken to stop it. The god died, and then, in the shadow, Someone repainted him into something he never was, the way a rainbow gets repainted yellow, the way an aging hero gets kept on as a mascot for a greatness that has left him. I raise all of this partly for accuracy, and partly because it bears directly on how we should read Bikini Bottom's relationship to its own gods, and to greatness in general. Because the town does not only revere its faded heroes, it also, gently, cannot tolerate the reappearance of anything really dangerous or wild or grown up, which is the herd's instinct we keep returning to, the instinct to sand down anything with a sharp edge. Even the show itself, in the real world, keeps running into this. There is an episode centered on Mr. Krabs having a kind of midlife crisis, going out with a couple of the old superheroes on a wild night that culminates in a raid on a house to steal underwear. And years after it aired, the network reviewed it and pulled it from rotation, deciding that some of its story elements were not appropriate, that the raid in particular crossed a line, and it has come and gone from the airwaves under that judgment more than once since. The point is not whether that decision was right or wrong. The point is the pattern, the endless, gentle, well-meaning smoothing down, the same instinct that honks a bird noise over a swear word, and repaints a rainbow, and keeps its gods as toothless old men. The instinct to make sure nothing in the bright little town ever has a genuine edge, ever demands anything, ever frightens anyone, ever grows too large or too wild or too real. It is the herd protecting its own comfort, extended outward from the fiction into the machinery that broadcasts the fiction, the world above the water, reaching down once again to make sure the world below stays soft. So this is the theology of Bikini Bottom, if you want to call it that. Its gods are dead or dying, feeble old heroes worshipped out of habit and love, in the shadow of a greatness that has left them. Its highest values have drained away while the rituals continue. And in the vacuum where living gods used to be, the town has installed the small comforts we have catalogued all night: the patty, the mall, the product to consume, the routine to repeat, the little pleasure for the day, and the little pleasure for the night. The death of God did not leave Bikini Bottom in despair. It left Bikini Bottom in a fast food restaurant, content, distracted, worshipping nothing higher than lunch, which is precisely the outcome Nietzsche was most afraid of. Not a dramatic collapse into darkness, but a soft, cheerful, endless afternoon in which nobody even remembers that anything has been lost. And the deepest question of the whole show, the one we have been building toward since the very first minute, is whether the yellow creature in the middle of that afternoon is the final proof of the disaster, or the one small secret loophole that redeems the whole thing. There is one more region of the show I want to walk through before I turn the question back on us, because it is where the last man's world is drawn most vividly, and that is the strange economy of Bikini Bottom, the way the town organizes desire itself. Because if you want to see the last man's little pleasures rendered as pure spectacle, you look at the episodes about consumption, and the show has many. There is one built entirely around a frenzy for chocolate, in which a pair of the town's fish, at the mere sight of the product, lose their minds completely, shrieking the word chocolate over and over in escalating hysteria, chasing the sellers down the street in a delirium of appetite. It is one of the funniest bits the show ever did, and it is also, if you tilt it, a flawless little portrait of what Nietzsche meant by the pursuit of the small pleasure, desire with no object higher than the thing to be consumed, the whole nervous system of a creature hijacked by the craving for a sweet. The town does not riot over ideas or over greatness or over freedom. It riots over candy. Its collective passions, when they finally ignite over products. And the show plays this for laughs precisely because it is true, because we recognize it, because a mob of fish screaming for chocolate is only a slightly exaggerated portrait of the marketplace crowd that cheered for the last man and begged to be made small. And underneath the consumption is the labor that feeds it, and the show is shrewd about that too. There is an episode where Squidward, pushed past his limit by Mr. Krabs' greed, organizes a strike, refuses to work, tries to rouse SpongeBob to the injustice of their exploitation. And the joke, the deep joke, is that SpongeBob cannot be roused, because SpongeBob does not experience the work as exploitation at all. He loves it. You cannot lead a labor revolt with a workforce that adores its own labor, and Squidward's strike collapses because the one thing a system of contented workers cannot produce is a rebellion. Now, I want to be careful here, because there is a whole tradition of reading SpongeBob as a story about capitalism, about the alienated worker, and the greedy owner, and the exploited labor of the Krusty Krab. And those readings are truly interesting, and I do not want to wave them away. But I also do not want to blur them into Nietzsche, because they are not the same, and the difference matters. The economic reading, the one descended from Marx, says the problem is the system, the arrangement of owner and worker, and that SpongeBob's cheerful labor is a kind of false consciousness, a worker tricked into loving his own exploitation. Nietzsche's reading is not about the system at all. It is about the soul. It does not ask whether SpongeBob is being economically exploited. It asks whether his contentment is the numbness of the last man, or the earned yes of amor fati, and that is a question about his interior, not about his wages. The two readings rhyme. They both look at the grinning fry cook and see something worth examining, but one is diagnosing an economy, and the other is diagnosing a state of the spirit, and a careful essay keeps them apart even while letting them sit in the same room. The purest image of SpongeBob's spirit, though, is not in the strike and not in the chocolate frenzy. It is in the episodes where he is simply put through absurd, escalating hardship and grins the entire way through it, out of nothing but love of the task. There is a famous early one, A Delivery Gone Wrong, in which he and Squidward are stranded far from home trying to deliver a single pizza, enduring one ridiculous misery after another, and where Squidward experiences the whole thing as a descent into pointless suffering. SpongeBob experiences it as an adventure, a chance to do his job well, a series of obstacles to be met with cheerful ingenuity and total devotion to the mission of getting the customer their food. Same journey, same hardships. One creature crushed, one creature glowing. It is the whole argument again, the same two responses to the same repetition, and it keeps recurring across the show because it is, whether the writers knew it or not, the show's actual subject, the one story it tells over and over in 1,000 costumes. How do you respond to a hard, repetitive, ultimately pointless task in an indifferent world? Squidward's way or SpongeBob's way? Gnash your teeth or throw your arms in the air and say you are ready. The whole series is that single question, asked again every 11 minutes, forever, and never once answered, because the show is honest enough to know it cannot be answered from the outside. Before I try to answer it, though, I want to turn the whole thing around and point it, gently, at the two of us. Because there is a version of this argument that is not about the sponge at all, and it has been sitting under the entire video, and it would be dishonest not to say it out loud. You are, in all likelihood, listening to this in order to fall asleep. You have put on a 3-hour meditation about a philosopher's warning against comfort, specifically because it is comforting, specifically because the sound of a calm voice narrating the lore of a friendly cartoon is one of the softest, safest, most undemanding things a tired person can wrap around themselves at the end of a hard day. And Nietzsche, if he is anywhere, is smiling a little grimly at that, because it is such a perfect image of the thing he described. The last man's little poison now and then, for pleasant dreams, the entertainment that must not exhaust you. Here we all are, a whole audience of tired creatures, reaching for the warmth of Bikini Bottom, the way its residents reach for a Krabby Patty, using the most soothing object we can find to smooth the edges off the day and slip painlessly into sleep. I am not scolding anyone, least of all you, and least of all myself, because I make these. I sit here in the dark building 3-hour blankets out of cartoon lore, and there is nobody more implicated in the comfort economy than the person narrating it to you right now. But I think it is worth naming, because the show is not just a picture of the last man. It is, for most of us, a tool we use to be a little more like him, to want a little less, to reach a little less, to sink a little more softly into the warm and the familiar. And whether that is a small surrender or a small mercy is, once again, a question only the inside can answer. This is the place to bring in the single most misunderstood idea Nietzsche ever had, because it is exactly the one that bears on all of this, and I have deliberately saved it, because it is easy to get wrong in a way that makes a person sound monstrous, and I want to handle it with care. Nietzsche was suspicious of pity, of compassion, of the reflex we have to rush toward suffering and soften it, to minimize discomfort wherever we find it. Now, said carelessly, that sounds like an argument for cruelty, and it is absolutely not, and anyone who tells you Nietzsche was in favor of being cruel to the suffering has not read him. His worry was subtler and, I think, worth taking seriously even if you end up disagreeing. He feared that a morality built entirely on pity, entirely on the goal of reducing suffering and maximizing comfort, would end by preserving and spreading weakness, would drag everyone down toward the level of the one who is suffering, and would forget that struggle and difficulty, and even pain, are the soil that greatness grows in, that a person who is never allowed to suffer is also never allowed to overcome anything, and a person who never overcomes anything never becomes anything. His fear was not that we would be kind. His fear was that we would become so devoted to comfort, so allergic to any hardness at all, that we would forget why anyone should ever strive, that we would smooth every edge and cushion every fall until there was nothing left in life sharp enough to grow against. Which loops straight back, of course, to Bikini Bottom, and to the honking bird noise over the swear word, and to the rainbow repainted a safe flat yellow, and to the gods kept on as harmless old men, and to a whole town organized so completely around frictionless cheer that nothing exceptional can ever survive in it. You can see the machinery of that comfort most clearly in the characters I have barely mentioned, the ones who fill out the town's soft middle. Consider Pearl, Mr. Krabs' teenage daughter, who is, in one of the show's strangest and most cheerfully unexplained biological jokes, a whale, an enormous whale, the daughter of a small crab, a mismatch the show simply never addresses, because addressing it would spoil the joke. Pearl is the town's adolescent, and what does she want? She wants the mall, she wants to shop, to be popular, to consume, to have the things her friends have, and she is perpetually embarrassed by her father's refusal to spend. She is the next generation of the herd, already fully formed, already wanting nothing higher than the next purchase and the next social approval, the last man in his teenage years, and the show presents this with total affection and no judgment, because within Bikini Bottom itself there is nothing to judge. Wanting the mall is simply what a healthy young fish wants. Or consider Mrs. Puff, the boating teacher, whose entire existence is a study in a kind of low-grade perpetual suffering that everyone treats as normal. She teaches, and her student fails, and she suffers, and she inflates with terror, and it happens again and again, forever, and nobody in the town seems to think there is anything strange about a life spent entirely inside that loop of small dread and small disappointment. She is, in her way, as trapped as anyone in the show, cycling through the same fear and the same failure endlessly, and the town simply absorbs her suffering as part of the comfortable background, the way it absorbs the fish who cries out that his leg is hurt in every crowd scene. That is the herd's relationship to suffering, in the end. Not to overcome it, not to learn from it, not even really to relieve it, but to smooth it into the background, to make it part of the soft, familiar texture of a world where nothing sharp is allowed to matter for very long. And here is where I will let the turn land, because it is the honest one. The show is gentle with all of these creatures, and I think we should be too, and I think Nietzsche, for all his ferocity on the page, would have understood the pull of it better than his reputation suggests. This was a man in near constant physical agony, half-blind, alone, who knew more about suffering than almost any philosopher who ever lived. He did not write against comfort because he had never needed it. He wrote against it because he understood exactly how seductive it is, how badly a hurting creature wants the warm and the soft and the painless, how reasonable it feels, in the middle of a hard life, to simply stop reaching and sink into the little pleasures and call it happiness. His warning was not the sneer of someone who found comfort easy to resist. It was the alarm of someone who knew precisely how hard it is to resist, who felt the pull of the last man in his own exhausted body and chose, again and again, from inside his pain, to keep reaching anyway, to keep saying yes to a life that gave him almost nothing but reasons to say no, which is, when you set it down next to the sponge, an oddly similar shape. Two creatures, one real and one drawn, both surrounded by every reason to curse their fate, both choosing joy from inside the hardship rather than comfort as an escape from it. The philosopher who warned us about the last man and the cartoon that looks exactly like the last man might, in the end, be reaching for the very same thing, an earned yes said in the teeth of everything. And with all of that finally on the table, the tired audience and the misunderstood pity, and the gentle town and the lonely man in the rented room, it is time to try to answer the question we started with. Let me lay the two verdicts side by side one last time, as cleanly as I can. and then tell you where I come down. Though I want to say in advance that I do not think the show comes down anywhere, and I think its refusal to is a kind of wisdom rather than a dodge. Here is the case for the prosecution. SpongeBob is the last man, the final and complete illustration of everything Nietzsche warned us about. He lives in a town built on a forgotten catastrophe, a suburb of small contented creatures who have traded every possibility of greatness for comfort and consumption. He does the same menial labor forever, with no ambition to be anything more, no curiosity about anything higher, no great longing, no star he steers by. He has invented happiness, and he blinks. He is the crowd in the marketplace that cheered when it was shown the picture of a small, safe, painless life, and cried out, "Give us that, make us into that." He is what a civilization becomes when it stops reaching, and the fact that he is so lovable, so warm, so easy to watch as you drift off to sleep, is not a mark against the reading but the very heart of it, because Nietzsche's whole terror was that the last man would not be horrifying, that he would be pleasant, that we would find him charming, that we would want to be him. And we do. Look at how many people fall asleep every night to the sound of his contentment. The most watched, most beloved, most comforting cartoon on earth is a portrait of the exact human outcome its subject most feared, and we love it precisely because it is so soothing, so undemanding, so free of any call to become more than we are. If that is not the warning coming true, I do not know what would be. And now the case for the defense, which is quieter, but which I find, in the end, more moving. SpongeBob is not the last man. He is the one creature who has passed the hardest test Nietzsche ever devised, and he has passed it so completely and so effortlessly that we mistake his triumph for simplicity. Remember the actual difference between the last man and the one who has achieved amor fati, because everything comes down to it. It is not what they do. Both of them love their small repeating lives. The difference is entirely interior, and it is the difference between a contentment that has never been tested and a contentment that has survived everything. The last man is comfortable because nothing has ever reached him. But SpongeBob is reached. Constantly, he fails at the one thing he keeps trying to do. He is mocked, exploited, terrified, humiliated, and hurt, over and over, in episode after episode. He has every reason a creature could have to curse his fate, to gnash his teeth at the demon, to wish for a different life, and he does not. He wakes up the next morning and throws his arms into the air and says he is ready, and he means it. That is not the numbness of a creature who has never suffered. That is the yes of a creature who has suffered and chooses joy anyway, again and again, without lying to himself about the suffering and without needing his life to be anything grander than it is. He does not need to pass the boating test to love his life. He does not need Squidward's recognition, or Mr. Krabs' money, or Sandy's mastery, or Plankton's victory. He wills the eternal return of his own ordinary Tuesday, the same patties, the same failed test, the same friends, the same small square patch of the same sea, and he wills it with his whole heart. That is amor fati. That is the love of fate. That is, in Nietzsche's own reckoning, close to the highest thing a being can achieve, and this cartoon sponge does it every single morning before breakfast. There is a line of Nietzsche's, one of the few that has escaped into the wider world more or less intact, in which he says that you must still have chaos within you to give birth to a dancing star. He meant it, in context, as a warning and a challenge to the very last men we have been describing, a way of saying that the smooth and orderly and comfortable soul, the soul with all its chaos, tidied safely away, has lost the very turbulence that any real creation requires. And it is worth holding that image against the sponge, because SpongeBob is, for all his sweetness, a honestly chaotic creature, absurd, unpredictable, overflowing, forever spilling out past the edges of any situation he is placed in. The order of his life, the same job, the same routine, the same square patch of sea, sits on top of a wild, churning, Dionysian energy that never stops bubbling up, and out of that combination, the settled routine and the inner chaos, comes the thing that everyone around him lacks. A dancing star, if you want to call it that. A joy that keeps generating itself out of nothing, day after day, in a world with every reason to be joyless. Squidward has order and no chaos, and produces nothing living. Patrick has chaos and no order, and produces only sleep. The sponge, somehow, has both at once, held in a balance so natural that it looks like foolishness, and that balance may be the whole secret, the exact fusion Nietzsche spent his life trying to describe, wearing an apron and whistling on its way to work. The reason the show can hold both of these readings at once, and never has to choose, is that they are describing the exact same behavior from the outside, and can only be told apart from the inside, and the show, being a show, only ever gives us the outside. We see the grinning creature going happily to his repetitive job. We do not get to see whether, underneath the grin, there is the numb blank of the last man, or the earned radiance of the one who has said yes to everything. And this is the thought that I keep landing on, the one that I think is the real payoff of spending 3 hours on this strange comparison. Maybe the reason we cannot tell them apart is that, at the very top and the very bottom, they are not actually that far apart. The lowest creature and the highest creature both love their lives and want nothing else. The animal that never woke up and the sage who woke all the way up and came back around both end in the same place. A being at peace with its own existence, wanting nothing different, saying yes. The whole enormous journey of the spirit, the camel and the lion and the child, the death of God and the confrontation with nihilism and the terrible test of the eternal return, the entire arduous climb, ends, if you make it all the way, in a state that looks from the outside almost identical to the contentment of a creature who never climbed at all, which means the yellow sponge is standing at both ends of the human possibility at once, the warning and the hope wearing the same square pants, and there is actually no way to tell, from where we sit, which one we are looking at. I find that a strangely profound accident in all of popular culture, and I do not think the people who made the show set out to build it, and I think that is exactly why it works. Because they did not set out to build a philosophy. They set out to build something warm and funny and true to the ocean, and the philosophy fell out of the warmth. Almost everything great in the show came the way that happens, sideways, by accident, out of failure. The single most emotionally perfect episode, the one where order and chaos fuse and Squidward touches the sublime, existed only because a different idea failed and got repurposed. One of the show's most beloved early adventures, a road trip full of absurd hardship that its cheerful hero grins straight through, began as the very first thing ever pitched for the series, a story modeled on an old road trip movie that was dropped and then salvaged years later. The show is held together by a physical reference book the crew made in the first year, a binder of construction drawings dictating exactly how each character must be drawn so that the same warm shapes could recur, unchanged, across a quarter of a century, the eternal recurrence enforced with a 3-ring binder. Over that quarter century, the thing won armfuls of the industry's highest awards, Emmy after Emmy, and became, officially, the longest-running animated series its country has ever produced, the most in-demand children's show on the planet by a wide margin, and all of it, the awards and the records and the accidental philosophy, grew out of a marine biologist's love of tide pools and a decision to square off a sea sponge so children would recognize it. Even the small imperfections carry the same accidental honesty. SpongeBob's own parents are drawn as round, natural sea sponges. Nothing like his square kitchen sponge shape, a mismatch the show has never once explained, as if to gently remind you that the most beloved figure in the whole cosmos does not even match his own family, does not quite belong to any category, is his own strange square exception to every rule, including the rules of his own household. So what would Nietzsche actually say if he could be set down in front of this show, this sick and gentle and lonely man who wrote about the death of God from a rented room and wept over a horse in the street? I think honestly, he would recognize almost everything. He would recognize the town of the last man, the comfortable herd cheering for its own smallness in the crater of a forgotten catastrophe. He would recognize Squidward instantly, the man of ressentiment who sees the emptiness and curdles rather than creates, the frustrated Apollonian drowning in a Dionysian world he is too proud to let redeem him. He would recognize Mr. Krabs, the will to power rotted into the worship of a coin, and Plankton, the will to power kept fierce and tireless, but poisoned by envy into an eternal doomed loop, and Patrick, the herd asleep, the innocence that came before the journey rather than after it, and Sandy, the lone self-overcomer with no disciples in a world engineered to prevent discipleship. He would recognize the eternal return made into the literal physics of a universe, and he would recognize, in the failed boating test, taken forever with a smile, the exact test he devised in his loneliest loneliness. And then I think he would come to the yellow one, the one at the center, and I think he would stop, because I think the yellow one is the thing he spent his whole broken life hoping was possible and could barely let himself believe in. A creature who lives the eternal recurrence and loves it. A creature who says the great yes, not out of numbness and not out of exhaustion, but out of some overflowing, unkillable joy that survives every hardship the world can throw at it and comes back every morning undimmed. Amor fati in a fry cook's hat. The love of fate, wearing an apron, flipping a patty, ready, always ready, for the same beautiful day one more time, and one more time, and one more time forever. And whether that creature is the disaster Nietzsche warned us about, or the miracle he hoped for, I do not think we get to know, and I have come to believe we are not supposed to. The show sets the warning and the hope down in the same body, ties them together so tightly that no blade could ever separate them, and leaves them there, grinning, on the sea floor, for us to look at as long as we want. Maybe the thing he feared most, and the thing he wanted most, really are the same yellow sponge, and the only difference between the end of the world and the redemption of it is a difference of the heart that no one on the outside will ever be able to see. So let me leave you there, on the sea floor, as the town goes quiet and the light stays exactly the same as it always does. It is strange, when you look at it long enough, that a cartoon about a sponge who flips burgers became one of the largest and most enduring things our culture has ever made. Running for more than a quarter of a century, translated into every language, carried into the sleep of millions of people who will never once think about the philosopher whose name is in the title of this video. A marine biologist drew a natural sponge in a comic he never published to teach children about tide pools and squared it off, and it grew into an ocean the whole world lives beside. And the thing that makes it last, I have come to think, is not the jokes, though the jokes are wonderful, and not the color, though the color is a balm. It is that underneath all of it, the show is softly asking the oldest and hardest question there is. The one Nietzsche asked from his rented room, and the one you might ask on a bad night when you cannot sleep, which is simply whether it is possible to love an ordinary, repeating, difficult life, exactly as it is, without needing it to be anything more. Bikini Bottom answers that question a dozen different ways at once. It shows you the ones who cannot love it and curdle, and the ones who cannot love it and hoard, and the ones who never had to ask, and the one who left to build a richer air, and the one, the yellow one, who somehow just does, every morning, without being able to explain how. I do not think the show knows which answer is right, and I have made my peace with the fact that neither do I, and I have come to feel that the not knowing is the most honest and the most comforting thing about the whole strange comparison, because it means the question is still open, for the sponge and for the town, and for the tired person listening in the dark. It means that whether your own repeating days are the warning or the hope has not been decided yet, that it is still, always, a difference of the heart, a thing that lives on the inside where no one else can see it, a yes or a no, that you get to keep saying, or unsaying, for as long as the days keep coming back around. Nietzsche spent his short, broken life trying to teach one thing above all, that we might learn to say yes to our lives, the real ones, the hard and ordinary ones, and mean it. And the most watched comfort object on earth is, when you strip away everything else, a small yellow creature saying exactly that, every single day, to a world that has given him every reason not to. I find, in the end, that I do not want to decide whether that is the disaster or the miracle. I would rather just let him keep saying it, and let it be the last thing you hear before you drift off, the sound of something small and battered and unkillably glad, throwing its arms into the air in the blue light at the bottom of the sea, ready, always ready, for one more ordinary day. Rest well. Thank you for spending this long, quiet while here with me, and with a philosopher and a sponge who turned out to have more in common than either of them could ever have guessed. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.